My name is Gwen. I am 34 years old, and I specialize in dismantling toxic corporate empires for a living. I just never expected my biggest hostile takeover would be my own family. I came home for Christmas expecting a quiet dinner, but instead found our $4 million estate completely abandoned, save for my grandfather sitting in the freezing dark. A handwritten note on the kitchen counter cheerfully explained that my parents and brother had flown to Paris for the holidays, leaving me behind to change the diapers of a man they claimed had lost his mind. They told me to be a good spinster and do my duty. But when I walked into the den, my grandfather was not confused or bedridden. He handed me a glass of neat bourbon, looked me dead in the eye, and asked if I was ready to burn their lives to the ground. I simply nodded. A week later, my family returned to screaming matches in the snow-locked doors and police sirens. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to financially ruin toxic relatives who underestimated your worth. The tires of my car crunched heavily against the unbroken snow of the long, circular driveway. The sound was sharp and isolated in the dead of the winter night, echoing against the massive brick facade of the property. I threw the vehicle into park and sat in the idling cabin for a long moment, staring up at the sprawling estate my parents proudly called home. It was Christmas Eve in one of the most affluent suburbs of Chicago. This was a time of year when the surrounding neighborhood was usually ablaze with excessive and highly competitive holiday lighting displays. My parents loved to show off their wealth and status to the neighbors, and normally their house would be the absolute brightest on the block, with elaborate glowing reindeer and thousands of cascading white lights. But tonight my family house was completely and utterly dark. There were no festive wreaths hanging on the massive mahogany double doors. There was no warm golden glow spilling from the floor to ceiling windows of the formal dining room. The house looked less like a welcoming family home and more like a dormant high-liability corporate asset that had been seized by the bank. As a mergers and acquisitions consultant, I spent my entire professional life evaluating dead weight and executing hostile takeovers. I looked at failing companies, stripped them down to their raw numbers, and decided if they were worth saving or selling off for scrap parts. Right now, looking at this cold and empty mansion, my childhood home felt like a sinking asset that desperately needed to be liquidated. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence rushed in to fill the cabin. It was heavy and suffocating. I grabbed my leather overnight bag from the passenger seat and stepped out into the biting blizzard. I had driven 4 hours straight from a grueling quarter-end closure in the city because my mother Brenda had left a frantic and guilt-laced voicemail that morning. She had claimed they were hosting an intimate and absolutely vital family gathering. She insisted that my absence would once again prove my total lack of commitment to our family core values. She knew exactly which emotional buttons to push to make me feel obligated to show up. I pulled my coat tighter against the freezing wind and punched my security code into the side door keypad. The heavy deadbolt clicked open and I stepped into the mudroom. I was immediately hit by a wall of stale and frigid air. The thermostat had clearly been dialed down to a bare minimum to save on heating costs. I could literally see my own breath forming small white clouds in the dim light of the entryway. "Mom! Dad!" I called out, my voice echoing loudly off the imported Italian marble flooring of the grand foyer. Nothing answered me. The silence in the massive house was absolute and terrifying. I walked into the open concept kitchen, my boots clicking against the pristine tiles. The massive quartz island was entirely empty, save for a single piece of heavy stock stationery resting deliberately beneath a heavy crystal paperweight. I did not even need to read the words yet to feel the familiar icy knot tighten in the pit of my stomach. This was their classic signature move, the ultimate bait and switch, the setup and the trap. I dropped my heavy bag onto the floor, walked over to the island, and slid the expensive paper out from under the glass weight. The handwriting belonged to my father, Richard. It was sharp, aggressive, and clearly rushed. Gwen Cameron Investors gifted the family a last-minute luxury holiday package to Paris. Mom Jada Cameron and I are already at the airport waiting to board our flight. Obviously, there was not an extra ticket for you, and honestly, with your single status and total lack of dependence, you have the most flexible schedule out of all of us anyway. Grandpa Teddy has taken a sharp downturn with his dementia this week. He is entirely incontinent and highly confused. Since you do not have a husband or a real family of your own to tend to, you are staying here to feed him and clean him. Do not make a mess of the house, and for the love of God, do not embarrass us if the neighbors ask why we left. We will be back after the new year. Dad. I read the note twice to ensure my eyes were not playing tricks on me in the dim lighting. The pure audacity of it did not shock me at all. It was the sheer, unadulterated disrespect woven into every single syllable that struck a deep nerve. Your single status. Lack of dependence. Clean him. They had not called me home for a warm family Christmas dinner. They had summoned me under entirely false pretenses to be their unpaid designated hospice nurse so they could parade around Europe on my older brother's supposed dime. Cameron was the ultimate golden child of our family. He was the tech bro prodigy who could simply do no wrong in their blinded eyes. Meanwhile, I, the woman who routinely facilitated $50 million corporate buyouts and negotiated international mergers, was viewed by my own parents as nothing more than a bitter unmarried spinster useful only for menial manual labor. I did not cry. Crying is a biological response to unexpected loss, and I had not lost anything tonight that I had not already lost a decade ago. I lost my family the day my parents made it explicitly clear that a daughter's entire worth was measured solely by her husband's tax bracket, and a son's worth was absolute and entirely unconditional, regardless of his actual achievements. I carefully folded the heavy stationery and slipped it into my coat pocket. It was a crucial data point. It was a receipt. In my line of work, you never throw away hard-written evidence of someone else's massive miscalculation. I walked past the dark kitchen and proceeded down the long, shadowed hallway toward the first-floor den. This was the isolated room where they had relegated my grandfather since his physical health began failing earlier this year. Grandpa Teddy was the man who had built the family wealth from the ground up. He was a steel-willed commercial real estate developer who had personally paid for the very marble my parents now walked on every single day. To see a man of his stature reduced to a burdensome inconvenience that they could casually abandon for a spontaneous Parisian holiday was deeply sickening. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors of the den, bracing my senses for the worst. I fully prepared myself for the terrible smell of illness and neglect. I readied my heart for the heartbreaking sight of the brilliant man who used to teach me how to read complex financial ledgers when I was 12 years old, now reduced to an empty shell of his former self. The large room was pitch black, save for the ambient moonlight reflecting off the snow outside and spilling through the glass patio doors. I stood quietly in the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the deep darkness, ready to face the grim and unfair reality of elder care that my toxic family had so callously dumped onto my tired shoulders. Before I could reach for the brass wall switch to illuminate the dark den, my phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket, completely shattering the quiet isolation of the house. I pulled the device out, the bright screen lighting up my face in the shadows with an incoming video call request. The caller identification flashed brightly in the dark room. It was Jada, my brother's wife. I swiped the green icon to accept the call, holding the phone up to eye level as the screen materialized into a chaotic and blindingly lit scene. Jada's face filled the entire frame. As a beautiful Black African-American aspiring luxury lifestyle influencer, Jada treated her marriage to my brother Cameron like a highly lucrative sponsored brand deal. Tonight, her flawless camera-ready makeup and intricate braids caught the ambient golden lighting of what was undeniably a luxury European hotel suite. Behind her head, I could clearly see gold-leafed crown moldings, massive crystal chandeliers, and an extravagant bouquet of white orchids that screamed absolute opulence. They were definitely staying at the Ritz in Paris. "Hey, Gwen," Jada cooed loudly, her signature condescension practically dripping through the phone speaker. She spun the camera around to aggressively showcase a massive velvet king-sized bed laden with an absurd amount of designer shopping bags. I could clearly make out the bold logos for Chanel, Dior, and Hermes stacked haphazardly against the pillows. Just wanted to check in and make sure you found the house keys okay. We felt so incredibly bad that there was not a first-class seat left for you on the flight. But honestly, Paris is really for lovers anyway, right? And well, you know how it is. She let the cruel sentence hang in the air. It was a deliberate and venomous pause, meant to specifically highlight my lack of a wedding ring and my supposedly pathetic solitary existence. I stared at the bright screen, my face remaining an entirely unreadable mask of corporate neutrality. It is freezing in the house, Jada. They turned the central heating completely off before they left for the airport. Oh, you know, Richard? Jada laughed, tossing her long braids over her shoulder, with a highly dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand. He hates wasting good money on utilities when the house is supposed to be empty. Just put on a heavy sweater and you will be fine. Anyway, Cameron is downstairs at the bar ordering us vintage champagne to celebrate, and your mom wanted to say hi before we head out to a private dinner. Before I could formulate a response, the phone was violently snatched from Jada's hand. The camera blurred dizzily for a second before my mother's face snapped into sharp and aggressive focus. Brenda's expression was tight, her eyes narrowed with that familiar scrutinizing glare that had defined and policed my entire childhood. Brenda barked loudly, completely bypassing any form of standard familial greeting or holiday wish. Did you check his adult diapers yet? The agency nurse was far too expensive to keep on payroll through the holiday weekend, so you need to strictly adhere to the feeding and cleaning schedule I left on the kitchen counter. Do not mess this simple task up. I read the note, Mom, I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and collected. You flat out lied to me. You told me this was going to be a mandatory family Christmas dinner. You lured me here under completely false pretenses just so you could flee the country. Brenda let out a loud, exasperated sigh, bringing her hand up to adjust a stray hair near her face. As she made the motion, the light caught a thick and incredibly sparkly diamond tennis bracelet wrapped around her wrist. I possessed a photographic memory for financial assets and personal property, and I knew for an absolute fact she had not owned that expensive piece of jewelry last month. Oh, stop playing the perpetual victim, Brenda sneered viciously. It is so exhausting dealing with you. We desperately needed a break from that house. Do you have any idea how stressful it is managing a massive estate and dealing with a dying old man every single day? No, you do not, because you just sit in your fancy glass office downtown, obsessing over corporate spreadsheets all day long, while your brother actually builds a massive legacy for this family. Cameron builds a legacy. I echoed the statement, unable to stop a harsh and cynical scoff from escaping my lips. Mom, Cameron has not launched a successful tech product in 3 years. His software startup is a running joke in the corporate industry. He literally lives off your constant financial handouts. Brenda's face flushed an ugly mottled red through the digital screen. How dare you speak about him that way? You are so unbelievably bitter and jealous of his life. Is this because you had to take out student loans to pay for your own degree while we happily gave Cameron his seed money? You chose a useless corporate desk job instead of marrying a strong provider like Jada did. You have no husband, no children, and no real responsibilities in this world to speak of. The absolute least you can do to repay us for raising you is wipe your grandfather's chin while we celebrate Cameron's massive success. What success exactly are we celebrating in a $3,000 a night suite at the Ritz Paris? I asked, my deeply ingrained mergers and acquisitions instincts flaring to life with alarming speed. The math simply was not matching up with reality. I knew exactly what my father's corporate salary was. I knew Cameron's supposed tech valuation was built entirely on empty promises and smoke. None of their legitimate combined income equated to impromptu six-figure luxury vacations in France, endless designer shopping sprees, and brand-new diamond tennis bracelets. Something was fundamentally and legally wrong with their current cash flow. That is absolutely none of your concern, Brenda snapped quickly. her voice pitching noticeably higher in sudden defense. Do your basic duty for once in your miserable workaholic life. Do not call this number again unless Teddy stops breathing entirely. The video feed abruptly went black. She had forcefully ended the call. I lowered the phone to my side, the freezing cold silence of the dark den pressing in around my shoulders once again. The absolute vitriol, the casual everyday cruelty, the brazen and unchecked entitlement, none of it was new behavior for them. But the sheer scale of the financial excess tonight felt entirely different. It felt rushed and desperate. They were definitely hiding something massive behind all that borrowed European glamour and designer luggage. I let out a slow, steady breath, preparing myself to turn on the overhead lights and face the grim and depressing task of checking on my ailing grandfather in his medical bed. She always did have a remarkably shrill and grating voice whenever she was lying through her teeth, a deep voice stated clearly from the shadows of the room. I froze completely in my tracks. The voice speaking in the dark was not weak. It was not confused shaking or slurred by the terrible ravages of cognitive decline. It was sharp, incredibly gravelly, and entirely lucid. I reached out blindly and flicked on a small brass desk lamp resting on the side table. Sitting comfortably in his favorite leather wingback chair bathed in the dim golden light was Grandpa Teddy. He was not strapped into a medical wheelchair. He was not wearing the soiled and sad pajamas my mother had complained about on the phone. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored wool cardigan and perfectly pressed slacks. He was standing perfectly upright next to a small wooden cart, holding two heavy crystal tumblers filled with neat amber bourbon. He extended one glass directly toward me, his piercing gray eyes locking onto mine with the lethal clarity of a corporate predator ready to strike. I stood paralyzed in the doorway of the den, my mind violently struggling to process the image in front of me. The man standing tall by the liquor cabinet was the very same man my mother claimed could no longer remember his own birthday. He was the man my father had deemed too incompetent to function without 24-hour supervision. Yet here he was pouring top-shelf liquor with a perfectly steady hand, exuding the exact same commanding presence he possessed when he ran the largest commercial real estate empire in the city. "You are not sick," I whispered the words, barely making it past my lips. My brain rapidly attempted to bridge the massive gap between the dire medical reports my parents had weaponized for months and the sharp, calculating patriarch looking back at me. Teddy offered a dark and entirely humorless chuckle as he walked toward me. "Your mother is a greedy parasite with a room temperature intelligence level, Gwen. I know exactly what my name is. I know exactly what day it is. And more importantly, I know exactly what they have been doing behind my back for the last 6 months. He pressed the cool crystal glass into my hand. The rich smell of expensive bourbon drifted upward, grounding me in the bizarre reality of the moment. I took a slow sip, letting the alcohol burn down my throat as I walked over to the leather sofa opposite his chair and sat down heavily. "Grandpa, what is going on here?" I asked, setting the glass on the mahogany coffee table. "Mom swore you had advanced dementia. She told the entire extended family you were completely incapacitated. She said you needed a full-time agency nurse just to survive the week." Teddy waved a dismissive and elegant hand in the air before taking a seat in his wingback chair. "Forged documents, or at the very least heavily manipulated diagnoses by a private concierge physician that your father plays golf with on the weekends. I noticed the money starting to move about 8 months ago. Small and cautious amounts at first. $100,000 here, $50,000 there. Unexplained wire transfers slowly bleeding out of my secondary holding accounts. They were stealing from you?" I asked, my professional corporate brain instantly snapping into laser focus. The discrepancy in their lavish Paris spending suddenly made perfect logical sense. "They thought they were stealing from me," Teddy corrected smoothly, a dark and lethal amusement playing at the corners of his weathered mouth. "They honestly thought the old man was finally losing his grip on the empire. So I decided to play along with their little fantasy. I started intentionally forgetting names at the dinner table. I started dropping expensive plates on the kitchen floor. I let Brenda hire that ridiculous overpriced nurse to hover over me. I wanted to see exactly how far my own son and his greedy wife would go if they truly believed there were absolutely no consequences for their actions. Teddy leaned forward in his chair, the deep shadows of the dim room carving harsh and unyielding lines into his aged face. He looked exactly like the ruthless business tycoon who had mercilessly crushed his competitors in the Chicago real estate market 40 years ago. "They got incredibly sloppy, Gwen," Teddy said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Richard managed to convince me to sign a medical power of attorney document back in late October. He aggressively claimed it was strictly for emergency health situations, just in case I ended up in the hospital. But your father is an absolute fool. He did not realize that a basic medical power of attorney does not magically grant him carte blanche over my primary irrevocable trusts. He has been illegally using that document to siphon massive amounts of cash from my retirement overflow accounts to fund Cameron's failing lifestyle and Jada's little internet show." I stared at him as the puzzle pieces rapidly locked into place inside my head. The sudden appearance of diamond tennis bracelets, the spontaneous first-class flights to Europe for the holidays, the $3,000 a night suite at the Ritz in Paris. They were not celebrating Cameron's fictional tech success. They were eagerly burning through Teddy's hard-earned cash before he even died, treating his impending death like their own personal lottery payout. "Why did you not stop them immediately?" I asked, leaning forward on the leather sofa. "You could have called the bank and frozen the accounts months ago. You could have locked them out before they spent a dime." "Because simply cutting off a branch does not kill the underlying rot in the tree," Teddy said coldly, taking another slow sip of his bourbon. "I needed them to step so far over the legal line that they could never ever walk back from it. I needed them to commit undeniable and federally prosecutable financial fraud on a massive scale." He reached down beside his leather chair and lifted a heavy and locked titanium briefcase. He set it squarely on the mahogany coffee table between us and slowly spun the combination locks. The heavy latches popped open with a loud and satisfying metallic clack that echoed in the quiet room. Teddy turned the open briefcase around to face me. Inside the padded interior were thick stacks of highlighted bank statements, official corporate filings, international wire transfer receipts, and the original physical deed to the $4 million estate we were currently sitting inside. "The vultures have finally left the nest," Gwen Teddy said, his voice carrying a lethal and uncompromising weight. He raised his crystal glass of bourbon toward me in a silent toast. "Shall we begin the audit?" I looked down at the overwhelming pile of incriminating documents. I looked up at the man who was the only person in this entire family to ever respect my intellect and my independence. The icy knot of familial rejection in my stomach completely melted away, instantly replaced by a cold and searing rush of absolute adrenaline. I did not just want to protect my grandfather from their abuse anymore. I wanted to systematically dismantle their entire lives. I reached into my leather overnight bag, pulled out my highly encrypted work laptop, and set it firmly on the table next to the briefcase. "Let us burn them to the ground." My fingers hit the keyboard, bypassing the standard login screens and diving straight into the encrypted biometric portal of my work interface. The harsh blue light from the monitor washed over the dark mahogany table, casting sharp shadows against the walls of the den. I did not bother turning on any overhead lights. The dim, isolated atmosphere felt entirely appropriate for the corporate execution we were about to orchestrate. Teddy reached into the open titanium briefcase and began extracting thick, meticulously organized manila folders. The sheer volume of documentation he had managed to collect, while supposedly suffering from advanced cognitive decline, was nothing short of staggering. He had categorized everything by financial institution date and transaction type. He had not just been sitting in the swingback chair staring at the wall. He had been quietly and methodically building a bulletproof legal trap for his own son. I launched my proprietary forensic accounting software. It was an elite tracking program I exclusively used during high-stakes corporate mergers to uncover hidden liabilities, offshore tax shelters, and embezzled funds before my clients signed multi-million-dollar acquisition contracts. Tonight, I was using it to dissect the financial anatomy of my own parents. Hand me the primary trust ledgers first. I instructed, my voice dropping into the clinical detached register I reserve for hostile boardrooms. I need to establish the baseline of your 8-figure retirement portfolio before we can track the exact trajectory of the bleeding. Teddy slid a heavy stack of bank statements across the table. I began rapid-fire data entry, feeding the account numbers, routing codes, and historical balances into the software. The program algorithm instantly began mapping out a digital web of connected financial institutions. Now Teddy said, his voice grating like crushed stone, "Look at the legal filings from late October. Richard filed a medical power of attorney with the county clerk. That was the skeleton key he used to unlock the vault." I accessed the secure county public records database and pulled up the digitized legal filings under my grandfather's name. The document materialized on my screen. It looked standard at first glance, featuring the signature of a private concierge doctor who frequently played golf with my father at his exclusive country club. The doctor had happily signed off on a highly fabricated cognitive assessment, legally declaring Teddy entirely unfit to manage his own daily affairs. But as I scrolled past the standard healthcare directives, my eyes locked onto a dense block of legal jargon buried deep on page 7. My jaw tightened, a surge of pure professional disgust rippling through my chest. "Grandpa, this is not just a medical directive," I stated, highlighting the text on the screen. Dad had his attorney draft a sweeping financial proxy clause and camouflage it under the guise of estate maintenance and emergency medical funding. "He legally weaponized your fake dementia diagnosis to bypass the dual signature security protocols on your secondary investment accounts." Teddy let out a short, humorless breath. He thought he was a genius. He thought the bank managers would take one look at the dementia diagnosis and hand over the keys without a second thought. And unfortunately, he was right. "Now trace the outflows, Gwen. Let us see exactly how much blood they have drained." I activated the software tracking sequence, linking the fraudulent power of attorney to the sudden spikes in account activity starting in early November. The screen immediately lit up with a chaotic flashing web of red transaction lines. They were all bleeding directly out of Teddy's pristine retirement trust and funneling into a series of newly opened checking accounts held jointly by Richard and Brenda. The sheer volume of the theft was staggering. It defied simple greed and crossed directly into reckless, arrogant gluttony. On November 3rd, Dad transferred $85,000 to a newly registered limited liability company in Delaware. I read aloud, my eyes darting across the digital path. 2 days later, that exact amount was wired to a luxury travel concierge service operating out of Manhattan. That single wire transfer funded the private jet charter to Paris and secured the multi-room luxury suite at the Ritz. "Keep digging," Teddy urged, leaning forward so that his face was fully illuminated by the glow of the laptop screen. "Look at your mother's personal spending habits." I filtered the search parameters to isolate all retail transactions linked to Brenda's newly inflated accounts. A tidal wave of excessive, frivolous, and highly conspicuous spending flooded my monitor. $42,000 at Cartier over the last 6 weeks. Another $28,000 at Hermes for customized leather goods. She had paid off a massive $60,000 balance at their country club that had been sitting in arrears for over a year, threatening their social standing. I stopped typing for a moment, a cold realization settling heavily over me. Every single time my mother had called me over the past 3 months to cruelly berate my modest consulting lifestyle, she had been actively dripping in diamonds and designer silk bought entirely with stolen money. She had weaponized her stolen wealth to make me feel small and insignificant, projecting her own financial insecurity onto my legitimate success. "It is textbook embezzlement," I stated, my professional detachment fully taking over the emotional shock. "They are not just casually moving cash around to cover basic living expenses. They are systematically laundering your retirement funds through personal luxury purchases to hide their newfound liquidity." I pulled up the total aggregate drain over the last 60 days. The software calculated the final sum, and the number flashed in bold red font on the screen. $4.2 million. In less than 2 months, they had siphoned over $4 million from an 8-figure trust fund. "But they are incredibly sloppy." I continued, my fingers flying back across the keyboard to lock in the digital evidence. The paper trail they left behind is a mile wide. They transferred funds across state lines to the Delaware Shell Company. They used those same fraudulent funds to purchase international flights and book foreign hotels. I looked up at Teddy, meeting his piercing gray eyes. The severity of the situation had instantly escalated from a twisted family betrayal to something far more dangerous. "Grandpa, this is not just local elder abuse or petty familial theft," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper. "By moving this stolen money across state borders and international lines using digital wire transfers, they have triggered federal jurisdiction. It is not just embezzlement anymore. It is a federal crime." Teddy smiled, a chilling and victorious expression that perfectly mirrored my own rising adrenaline. "I know, Gwen," Teddy replied smoothly, taking a final sip of his bourbon and setting the empty crystal glass down on the mahogany table. "And we are going to make sure they serve every single minute of their sentence." I turned my attention back to the glowing monitor, my fingers hovering over the keyboard with renewed purpose. If my parents were going to play the game of high-level financial fraud, I was going to show them exactly why I was the highest-paid consultant at my firm. I initiated a deep-dive subroutine on my software, a tool designed to pierce corporate veils and trace money laundering through international borders. Richard thought he was a criminal mastermind by using a medical power of attorney, but his execution was laughably amateurish. I watched as the digital map expanded across my screen. Richard and Brenda had not just moved the money into domestic checking accounts. They had attempted to mask the origin of the funds by routing a significant portion of the stolen $4 million through a convoluted series of cascading transfers. I traced the digital footprint, from Teddy's primary trust to a ghost account registered in the Cayman Islands under a newly formed corporate entity. From there, the money was being drip-fed back into their personal accounts to avoid triggering automatic IRS alerts for large deposits. It was a classic layering technique often used by desperate executives trying to hide embezzled assets before a corporate collapse. But they left massive, gaping holes in their paper trail. I highlighted a series of wire transfers that had occurred over the past 30 days. The sheer vanity of their expenditures was laid out before me in undeniable black and white data. They had wired $150,000 to secure a seasonal membership at an elite invitation-only ski resort in Aspen, a place they had never even visited. Another $200,000 had been dumped into a private wealth management account solely to cover their exorbitant daily expenses, which apparently included weekly $5,000 visits to high-end cosmetic surgeons and private stylists. I pulled up the itemized credit card statements linked to the laundered accounts. The Paris trip was merely the grand finale of a months-long spending spree. My eyes scanned the endless rows of luxury retail transactions. Balenciaga, Prada, Tom Ford, Louis Vuitton. The dates of the purchases matched up perfectly with our recent family gatherings. I paused, my hands resting on the cold mahogany table as a visceral memory hit me with blinding clarity. I remembered sitting at the formal dining table for Thanksgiving dinner just 6 weeks ago. My mother had been holding court at the head of the table wearing a pristine white tweed Chanel blazer that looked like it belonged on a Paris runway. I had flown in straight from closing a merger in New York, wearing a sharp but understated tailored navy suit. Brenda had spent a full 20 minutes loudly dissecting my appearance in front of our extended family. She had sneered at my suit, calling it a tragic off-the-rack uniform of a woman who had given up on ever finding a husband. She had swirled her expensive wine and openly mocked my modest consulting lifestyle, loudly proclaiming that it was such a shame I had to work so hard just to afford basic necessities while her darling Cameron was building an empire. A cold, razor-sharp fury crystallized in my chest. Every single time my mother had looked down her nose at me over the past few months. Every time she had belittled my career and mocked my independence, she had been literally wearing my grandfather's stolen retirement funds. She had used the money she embezzled from a dying man to purchase the very armor she wore to make me feel small. She was nothing but a glittering hollow fraud parading around in stolen silk, desperately trying to project an illusion of wealth while standing in the presence of my actual self-made success. I let out a slow, dark laugh. The absolute hypocrisy of it was almost poetic. They are incredibly arrogant, I said aloud, breaking the silence of the den. Teddy leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the screen. But arrogance breeds carelessness, Grandpa. Mom spent weeks berating me for working for a living, all while funding her entire wardrobe with your life savings. Let her enjoy the clothes, Teddy replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. She is going to need them when she is standing in front of a federal judge. Where is the rest of the capital, Gwen? The math on the retail therapy does not account for the missing $4 million. He was right. I ran a sum function on the luxury spending, the country club arrears, and the Paris vacation. It totaled approximately $1.2 million. That left a gaping void of roughly $3 million that had vanished from the Cayman Islands offshore account. I cracked my knuckles and dove deeper into the routing data. If they were hiding $3 million, it was not sitting in a checking account. It had been invested or funneled into a highly illiquid asset. I bypassed the standard consumer banking ledgers and initiated a search through commercial wire transfers. The software ground through the encrypted data for what felt like an eternity. The progress bar inched across my screen, deciphering the masked routing numbers Richard had used to hide his largest theft. Then the system chimed softly. The final destination of the missing $3 million populated on my monitor. I stared at the beneficiary name, my eyes widening slightly as the ultimate puzzle piece slammed violently into place. I found the missing $3 million. I breathed, my voice barely more than a whisper. Teddy tilted his head. Where did Richard bury it? I turned the laptop screen toward him, highlighting the bold corporate name at the end of the digital money trail. He did not bury it in real estate or offshore bonds, Grandpa. He wired every single cent of the remaining $3 million directly into a corporate holding account registered under Nova Tech Solutions. Teddy's eyes narrowed. Cameron's company. I nodded, feeling a lethal predatory smile stretch across my face. Yes, the supposedly billion-dollar tech startup that Cameron has been bragging about for years. The company that Mom claims is building our family legacy. They did not just steal your money to buy designer bags, Grandpa. They stole it to artificially inflate Cameron's fraudulent empire. The trail leads directly to the golden child. I cracked my knuckles, the sharp sound echoing in the silent den. If my parents had funneled $3 million into Novatech Solutions, I needed to see exactly how deep the rot went. I opened a new secure tab and bypassed the standard consumer databases, plugging Cameron's employer identification number directly into the Federal Corporate Registry. As a mergers and acquisitions consultant, I routinely dissected the financials of multi-million-dollar corporations. Tearing apart my brother's glorified science project was going to be child's play. The loading wheel spun for a fraction of a second before vomiting a deluge of corporate filings onto my screen. I bypassed the executive summaries and went straight for the quarterly profit and loss statements. My eyes darted across columns of raw data, actively hunting for legitimate revenue streams, active client contracts, or any tangible product delivery metrics. There were none. Absolutely zero. Novatech Solutions had not generated a single dollar of actual commercial revenue in over 36 months. What I found instead was a sprawling financial graveyard. It was a completely hollow shell company. I pulled up the legal history and felt a grim, cynical smile touch my lips. 2 years ago, Cameron had quietly filed for corporate bankruptcy protection. He had completely burned through his initial venture capital, alienated his legitimate angel investors, and defaulted on his expensive downtown commercial lease. The company had legally collapsed under the sheer weight of his incompetence and monumental ego. Yet the corporate entity remained active on paper. Why? Because Richard and Brenda had stepped in to act as illegal fraudulent life support. They were using Teddy's stolen retirement funds to artificially inflate the dead company. They were systematically laundering the embezzled $3 million by classifying the illegal wire transfers from the Cayman Islands as anonymous venture capital investments. They were creating fake cash flow to keep the illusion alive. I pulled up the corporate expense accounts linked directly to Novatech's operating budget. The screen populated with a staggering list of charges that made my blood boil with intense, righteous fury. Jada was officially listed on the payroll as the chief marketing officer, pulling a completely fraudulent six-figure salary for a company that possessed no actual product to market. But the fake salary was merely the tip of the iceberg. I cross-referenced her highly curated social media feed with the corporate credit card statements. The pieces aligned with sickening perfection. The private jet charter she flaunted on Instagram last month for a weekend trip to Miami, billed directly to Novatech as a corporate travel expense. The massive collection of rare designer handbags she unboxed for her thousands of followers, expensed to the company as promotional marketing materials and client gifts. Even the monthly lease payments for the luxury Porsche Macan she drove around Chicago were being deducted directly from the stolen funds my father had wired. Jada had married Cameron strictly for his fake billionaire status. She genuinely believed she had secured a high-value elite provider who could endlessly fund her luxurious influencer aesthetic. In reality, she had legally tethered herself to a broke, failing fraud. Her entire digital empire, every designer outfit, every extravagant vacation was built entirely on the stolen life savings of a dying man. I stared at the screen, deeply revolted by the sheer magnitude of the delusion. My parents were perfectly willing to commit severe federal financial crimes just to ensure their precious golden child never had to face the reality of his own utter incompetence. They would rather rob their own father blind, stripping away his security in his final years than admit to their wealthy country club friends that their perfect son was a colossal, undeniable failure. They had sacrificed my grandfather's dignity to protect Cameron's fragile ego. I turned the laptop screen toward Teddy. The harsh clinical light from the monitor illuminated the deep lines on his face. Look at this, Grandpa. Cameron is completely broke. Novatech is a zombie corporation. He has no clients and no software. They are aggressively using your stolen money to pay for Jada's fake internet lifestyle and Cameron's empty executive title. They are bleeding you dry just so he can pretend he is important. I expected anger. I expected the righteous fury of a man who had worked his entire life to build an empire, only to see it squandered on designer bags and private jets. But Teddy did not look angry. He did not look betrayed or devastated. Instead, he leaned back into the deep leather of his wingback chair, folded his hands over his stomach, and let out a cold, sharp laugh. It was a terrifying, deeply calculating sound that sent an immediate shiver down my spine. It was not the laugh of a victim. It was the sound of an apex predator who had just watched his prey step willingly into a jagged steel trap. He looked at me, his gray eyes flashing with a ruthless, brilliant light that defied his age. I know Cameron is a spectacular failure, Gwen. I knew it the very day he came begging to my office for his initial seed money 7 years ago. The boy has his mother's arrogance and his father's utter lack of strategic vision. It is a lethal combination for business. I frowned, my hands hovering over the keyboard. If you knew he was a failure, why did you give him the capital to start Novatech in the first place? Teddy smiled, exposing his teeth in the dim light. Because I am a businessman, Gwen. I never write a check without securing absolute leverage over my investment. Your father thought he was incredibly clever by hiding the stolen $3 million inside Cameron's company. He assumed I had no access to those corporate accounts. He forgot one crucial detail about how I operate. Teddy pointed a long, steady finger at my laptop screen. Pull up the original incorporation papers. Look at the foundational operating agreement from the very day Novatech Solutions was legally born in the state of Illinois. Read the fine print of the capital investment clause. I navigated away from the expense reports and dug deep into the state digital archives. It took a few extra keystrokes to bypass the redacted public files and access the original unedited incorporation documents filed 7 years ago. The PDF loaded onto the screen with a sharp flash of white. I scrolled past the standard liability clauses and the executive board naming conventions, stopping dead at Section 4. The capital investment structure. My eyes scanned the dense legal text. I read it once, blinked in sheer disbelief, and read it a second time to ensure my professional brain was interpreting the corporate jargon correctly. My heart began to pound a heavy rhythmic beat against my ribs. I looked at my grandfather, absolute awe washing over me. "You did not just give him a seed money loan," I whispered, pointing at the glowing screen. "You did not even give him a standard venture capital investment with a minority stake. You structured the initial funding as a hostile equity grab from day one. You hold 51% of the voting shares." "I never fund a sinking ship without holding the only lifeboat," Teddy said smoothly, his eyes gleaming with unapologetic cunning. "Cameron gets to call himself the chief executive officer on his fancy business cards. But I possess the absolute legal authority to liquidate the company, fire the entire executive board, and seize all corporate assets at my sole discretion." Richard thought he was hiding $3 million in his son's impenetrable fortress. He actually wired it directly into my personal vault. But Teddy was not finished. The corporate trap was only the first layer of his defense. He reached back into the padded interior of the titanium briefcase and extracted a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with heavy wax. He broke the seal with his thumb and slid a stack of heavy watermarked paper onto the mahogany coffee table between us. "Look at the name on the master deed," Teddy instructed, tapping the top page. "Look at who actually owns the imported marble you are standing on." I picked up the heavy document, the stiff paper rustling in the quiet den. It was the original property deed for the sprawling $4 million suburban estate we were currently sitting inside. This was the house my parents had proudly flaunted at every country club dinner. This was the mansion Brenda claimed she had painstakingly designed and purchased with Richard's brilliant market investments. I scanned down to the ownership registry at the bottom of the page. There was only one name listed as the sole proprietor: Theodore Reginald Hastings. "They never owned it," I breathed, staring at the bold black ink. "Not a single brick," Teddy confirmed, taking another calculated sip of his bourbon. "I bought this property 20 years ago entirely in cash. I let your father live here rent-free to maintain his fragile ego in front of his corporate partners. He pays the annual property taxes, but I hold the absolute and uncontested title. They have spent 2 decades acting like royalty in a castle they do not even own." Now Teddy leaned forward, the golden light from the desk lamp casting sharp, predatory shadows across his face. "It is time to execute the final phase of the audit. I am an old man, Gwen. I have maybe a few years left, and I refuse to spend them watching my greedy son and his vapid wife bleed my legacy dry. But if I act against them directly right now, they will tie me up in endless probate courts. They will aggressively claim elder abuse or mental incompetence to stall the asset recovery. They will weaponize the fraudulent medical proxy to freeze my actions and drain the accounts in legal fees. So we cut them off at the knees," I said, my mind racing with advanced legal strategies and acquisition tactics. "We move the assets completely out of their reach before their flight even lands back in Chicago." "Exactly," Teddy said. He pulled a fresh, pristine stack of legal documents from the bottom of the briefcase. "I had my personal attorney draft these emergency transfer papers 3 days ago. They are completely ironclad, utilizing the exact same corporate loopholes your father loves so much. But I need a successor who possesses the absolute ruthlessness required to pull the trigger and execute the hostile takeover." He slid the papers across the smooth wood toward me. I looked down at the bold black text heading the first page. It was an emergency transfer of assets. This was not a will. This was not a trust provision that could be contested after his death. It was an immediate, legally binding execution of property and absolute power. The first document was an absolute, irrevocable power of attorney, granting me total and uncontested control over Teddy's financial and legal affairs. This document would instantly override and permanently nullify the fraudulent medical proxy Richard had secretly filed. The second document was a quitclaim deed transferring sole ownership of the $4 million estate directly into my name. The third was a corporate transfer ledger legally signing over the 51% controlling interest of Novatech Solutions to me. I stared at the designated signature lines. The immense gravity of what was sitting on the table hit me with staggering force. This was not just a defensive maneuver to protect his retirement funds from greedy relatives. This was a total, unmitigated transfer of the entire family empire into my hands. They left you here to clean up my mess, Teddy said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register that demanded absolute compliance. I say we let you clean up theirs. Take the pen, Gwen. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I picked up the heavy silver fountain pen Teddy offered. The cool metal felt perfectly grounding against my skin like a weapon custom forged for my hand. I pressed the nib to the thick paper and signed my name with sharp, deliberate strokes. I signed the power of attorney. I signed the property deed. I signed the corporate ledger. Teddy took the pen from my hand and added his own bold, flourishing signatures right next to mine, validating the massive transfer under the strict eyes of the law. The ink dried quickly, sealing our pact. I closed the leather folder, the sharp slap of the cover echoing like a gunshot in the silent den. A cold, dark satisfaction settled deep into my bones, replacing years of familial rejection with pure adrenaline. The dynamic of my entire existence had just been violently rewritten in the span of 30 minutes. I was no longer the discarded spinster daughter ordered to wipe chins. I was legally the sole owner of the $4 million mansion my parents were currently sleeping in. I was the absolute boss and majority shareholder of the tech company my arrogant brother pretended to run. My toxic family had flown to Paris thinking they were untouchable royalty. They had absolutely no idea they were coming home as my tenants and my employees, completely and utterly at my mercy. The freezing dawn of December 26th broke over the estate with a blinding and sterile clarity. The blizzard had finally passed, leaving the sprawling front lawn buried under a foot of pristine, undisturbed snow. Inside the den, the atmosphere was charged with the quiet, lethal electricity of a corporate war room right before a major acquisition went public. I had not slept a single minute. I spent the remainder of the night brewing black coffee and cross-referencing every single account routing number with the newly signed transfer documents. At precisely 7 in the morning, the heavy crunch of tires on snow broke the absolute silence of the property. A sleek black town car idled at the front gates. I used my newly acquired administrative access on the smart home application to open the wrought iron gates. A tall, razor-sharp man in a bespoke charcoal suit stepped out of the vehicle carrying a heavy leather briefcase. This was Elias Donovan. He was Teddy's personal attorney, a man who possessed a legendary reputation in the Chicago financial district for being an absolute unyielding shark. Donovan did not deal in family law or petty domestic disputes. He dealt in high-yield asset protection, aggressive wealth management, and hostile corporate restructuring. He was the perfect legal executioner for the morning's agenda. I unlocked the front door and let him into the grand foyer. Donovan did not bother with pleasantries or holiday greetings. He simply gave me a curt professional nod, stamped the snow off his polished Oxfords, and walked directly toward the den. He operated with the exact same ruthless efficiency that I demanded from my own corporate legal teams. Teddy was already waiting at the mahogany table nursing a fresh cup of dark coffee. Donovan set his briefcase down, popped the latches, and extracted a thick stack of federal injunction forms. I assume the patient is ready to be discharged, Donovan said, his voice a dry, gravelly baritone that commanded immediate authority. Teddy offered a sharp, dangerous smile. The patient is officially taking the hospital off life support, Elias. Review the transfer documents. I slid the heavy watermarked papers across the table. Donovan picked up his reading glasses and scrutinized the signatures on the irrevocable power of attorney, the estate quitclaim deed, and the Novatech Solutions corporate transfer ledger. He checked the dates, verified the witness lines we had digitally secured through his paralegal the night before, and gave a sharp nod of absolute approval. These are flawless, Donovan stated, placing the documents into his secure folder. As of this exact second, Gwendolyn is the sole uncontested legal administrator of this entire empire. Richard's fraudulent medical proxy is now officially dead paper. Donovan pulled out his encrypted tablet and synced it to my forensic accounting software. We are not just going to send a polite cease and desist letter to your father, he explained, his fingers flying across the digital interface. A letter gives them time to panic, hire defense counsel, and attempt to hide whatever liquid cash they currently possess. We are going to initiate a hard, unyielding freeze on their entire financial existence. I leaned over the table, bringing up the master list of compromised accounts I had mapped out during the night. We need to target the primary arteries first. I instructed, highlighting the joint checking accounts Richard and Brenda used for their daily exorbitant expenses. Once those are locked, we sever the offshore Cayman pipeline. If we cut off the laundering route, Cameron's corporate accounts at Novatech will instantly run dry. Donovan smirked, clearly approving of my aggressive corporate strategy. I am drafting the emergency legal injunctions directly to the executive branch of the wealth management firms. Because you hold the verified master power of attorney, the banks are legally obligated to comply immediately to prevent further asset bleeding. I am classifying Richard's recent withdrawals as active, unverified, fraudulent activity. This classification was a lethal tactical move. By flagging the previous transactions as active fraud, the banking institutions would not just pause the accounts. They would trigger their internal anti-money laundering protocols. Every single credit card, debit card, and digital payment system linked to Richard, Brenda, Cameron, and Jada would be instantly declined and subjected to a mandatory federal hold. We spent the next 2 hours systematically inputting every single routing number, offshore ghost account, and corporate credit line into Donovan's mass injunction filing. We targeted the black cards Brenda used for her designer shopping sprees. We locked down the corporate expense accounts Jada used to fund her fake influencer lifestyle. We even froze the automated payment system tied to the lease of Jada's luxury Porsche. We built a flawless, impenetrable legal fortress around my grandfather's wealth, completely locking the rest of the family on the outside. By 9 a.m, the trap was fully loaded and primed. I glanced at the heavy brass clock sitting on the mantel. It is currently 9:15 in Chicago. I noted my pulse accelerating with pure cold anticipation. That means it is exactly 4:15 in the afternoon in Paris. Teddy leaned back in his leather wingback chair, steepling his fingers together. Prime shopping hours on the Champs-Élysées. Brenda and Jada have likely finished their expensive champagne lunches and are currently walking into a high-end boutique to purchase their afternoon souvenirs. They are entirely exposed, I said, looking at the glowing red execution command flashing on Donovan's tablet screen. They are sitting in a foreign country, completely reliant on a stream of stolen money that is about to evaporate into thin air. They do not have backup funds. They do not have independent wealth. They have absolutely nothing but the plastic cards in their wallets. Donovan adjusted his suit jacket, his eyes locked onto the digital interface. The legal injunctions are queued directly to the banking mainframes. Once I hit this button, the automated fraud protocols will activate across global networks within 60 seconds. Every single financial lifeline they possess will be instantly and permanently severed. He looked up, shifting his gaze from Teddy to me. He recognized exactly who held the ultimate authority in the room now. "Are we ready to initiate the hostile takeover, Gwendolyn?" Donovan asked, his voice steady and deadly. I thought about the cruel, dismissive note left on the kitchen island. I thought about Brenda's shrieking voice calling me a bitter spinster, completely unaware that she was financing her arrogance with stolen money. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated disrespect they had shown the man who built their entire privileged existence. My family had played a careless, reckless game, assuming they would never face a single consequence for their greed. I looked down at the tablet, my expression hardening into an unyielding mask of pure corporate retribution. "Execute," I commanded. Donovan pressed his finger firmly against the glowing screen. The digital transmission sent immediately, silently crossing the Atlantic Ocean to sever their lives. The European banking hours were wide open, and my family's financial execution had officially begun. 4,000 miles away, the digital guillotine dropped with absolute precision. Inside the dimly lit den in Chicago, the three of us sat in total silence, our eyes glued to the glowing monitor of my forensic accounting software. I had configured the system to mirror the live alerts from the bank's fraud department. We did not have to wait long. It took exactly 14 minutes for the first domino to fall. A sharp electronic chime echoed from my laptop speakers. A bright red notification banner flashed across the screen. It was a transaction denial originating from the flagship Cartier boutique on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. The attempted purchase amount was $12,400. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. I could perfectly visualize the exact scene unfolding across the Atlantic. Jada would be sitting on a plush velvet sofa in the private VIP viewing room of the boutique. She was likely sipping complimentary vintage champagne, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against a glass table, as she waited for the sales associate to wrap up her latest trophy. A $12,000 handbag purchased entirely with stolen retirement funds, meant to be aggressively flaunted to her online followers. She would have casually handed over the heavy metal black card, expecting the usual fawning subservience from the retail staff. Instead, the sales associate would have swiped the card through the luxury terminal, only to be met with a glaring red error code. Declined. Do not honor. I watched the live feed on my monitor as a second red banner popped up less than 40 seconds later. Jada had obviously scoffed, blamed a mundane banking glitch, and dug into her designer purse to produce a second card. This one was a platinum credit line tied directly to Brenda's accounts. Declined. Fraud alert active. A third notification flashed on my screen. This time it was Cameron trying to save face. I could picture my brother stepping forward, puffing out his chest, and handing over the corporate expense card for Novatech Solutions. He probably fed the staff some arrogant lie about international security measures, tripping up their personal accounts. The associate would have swiped the corporate card with a polite, strained smile. Declined. Account frozen. The humiliation inside that silent, pristine boutique must have been absolutely suffocating. In the world of high-end luxury retail, the shift from royalty to liability happens in the blink of an eye. The complimentary champagne would be discreetly cleared away. The eager smiles of the staff would harden into cold professional masks of judgment. Jada and Cameron would have been politely but firmly asked to provide an alternative form of payment or leave the premises immediately. With empty hands and burning cheeks, the golden child and his influencer wife were unceremoniously forced out onto the freezing Parisian pavement. Back in Chicago, Teddy let out a low, rumbling laugh. The first strike is always the sweetest, he noted, tapping his fingers against his armchair. But Richard will not accept defeat that easily. He will assume it is an automated error. He will try to use his perceived authority to bully his way out of the problem. Teddy was entirely correct. 20 minutes later, my screen lit up with a barrage of new alerts. This time, the location had shifted. The geographical ping registered directly at the front desk of the Ritz Paris. Jada and Cameron had clearly stormed back to the luxury hotel empty-handed and panicked. I imagined them bursting into their $3,000 a night suite, waking Richard and Brenda to complain about the massive inconvenience. Richard, furious that his holiday was being interrupted by administrative incompetence, would have marched straight down to the grand lobby. He operated on the arrogant belief that his booming voice and aggressive posturing could solve any logistical hurdle. The digital log on my screen showed Richard attempting to run his primary wealth management card at the hotel concierge desk. He likely demanded the staff run a manual authorization barking orders at the concierge to contact his VIP banking liaison back in the States to clear the ridiculous hold. The concierge at the Ritz, trained to handle billionaires and global elite, would have remained perfectly calm. He would have processed the manual authorization request through their international merchant terminal. My screen flashed with the most severe alert yet. Code 04, confiscate card. Suspected fraud. I narrated the incoming data to Teddy and Donovan. Richard just hit the brick wall. The merchant terminal at the Ritz did not just decline the transaction, it actively flagged his physical card as a stolen asset. The hotel staff are legally obligated to confiscate the plastic. The sheer panic setting in at that marble concierge desk would be absolutely paralyzing. The polite hotel manager would inform my father that his accounts were not experiencing a simple international hold. They were completely locked under severe federal fraud protocols. Richard's arrogant bluster would evaporate into thin air, instantly replaced by a cold, suffocating terror. He was standing in the lobby of one of the most expensive hotels on the planet, racking up thousands of dollars in room charges by the hour. He was responsible for 4 adults accustomed to extreme luxury, and he suddenly had absolutely zero access to capital. He could not withdraw cash. He could not book a flight home. He could not even buy a cup of coffee at the airport. He was entirely stranded in a foreign country, utterly stripped of the financial armor he used to intimidate the world. Then came the final devastating blow. Donovan's tablet chimed in sync with my laptop. The automated legal notification system had successfully delivered its payload. Right there in the opulent lobby of the Ritz, Richard's mobile phone would light up with an urgent, high-priority email from the executive tier of his wealth management firm. He would eagerly open it, praying for a resolution or a simple security verification link. Instead, he would read a cold, legally binding notification. The email plainly stated that all affiliated trust funds, credit lines, and corporate accounts had been immediately frozen, pending a severe criminal investigation. But the true horror would not be the freeze itself. It would be the final sentence of the email. The accounts were not under investigation by an anonymous algorithm or a random bank manager. The email explicitly stated that the comprehensive fraud investigation had been initiated directly by the verified legal primary account holder, Teddy Hastings, and his newly appointed sole legal administrator, Gwendolyn Hastings. The name hung in the cold air of the den, vibrating with a lethal absolute permanence. Less than 30 seconds later, the profound and heavy silence of our Chicago estate was violently shattered. My personal cell phone resting face up on the polished mahogany coffee table directly next to my encrypted laptop began to vibrate with a frantic, buzzing urgency. The caller identification flashed brightly in the dim lighting. The screen displayed my father's name in bold, demanding letters, Richard. I did not pick it up immediately. I sat perfectly still, letting the device shudder against the hardwood surface. The vibration was a physical manifestation of his rapidly mounting terror. Across the table, Teddy took a slow, deliberate sip of his premium bourbon, his sharp gray eyes locked onto the glowing phone screen with a look of deep, predatory satisfaction. Beside him, Attorney Donovan did not even blink. The ruthless lawyer simply adjusted his crisp cuffs with the detached professional grace of a man who orchestrated high-stakes corporate executions every single day. They were silently giving me the floor. This was my chosen battlefield. This was the exact moment I officially assumed command of the family empire. I swiped the green icon to accept the incoming call and firmly pressed the speakerphone button, ensuring his desperation would be broadcast crystal clear into the quiet, shadowy room. "Gwen? What the hell did you do?" Richard roared through the tiny speaker. His voice was a frantic, strained bark that echoed with absolute unhinged hysteria. The background noise coming through the audio feed was entirely unmistakable. I could clearly hear the muted, sophisticated murmur of the Ritz Paris Grand Lobby. I could hear the sharp clinking of heavy brass luggage carts and the hushed, urgent whispers of elite hotel staff desperately trying to manage a deeply embarrassing public disturbance. Richard was causing a massive scene in one of the most exclusive establishments on the planet, and his cultivated aristocratic facade was actively melting down in real time. "Turn it back on right now," he screamed, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of paternal authority or country club decorum. "I know you hacked the checking accounts, you little ungrateful thief. I am standing right here at the main concierge desk and the management is telling me my platinum cards are flagged for severe fraud. You reverse whatever ridiculous digital stunt you just pulled back in Chicago, or I swear to God, I am calling the local authorities and having you arrested for international cybercrime. I will see you thrown in federal prison for this. I will ruin your entire miserable life. Fix the banking glitch right now." I let his heavy, panicked breathing fill the silence of the den. I did not interrupt his manic tirade. I did not raise my voice to match his chaotic energy. I simply leaned forward, bringing my face close to the phone microphone, and prepared to deliver the killing blow. I spoke with the exact same terrifyingly calm clinical register I utilized when liquidating a bankrupt subsidiary during a hostile corporate takeover. I stripped him of his title as my father, addressing him as nothing more than a failed hostile liability. "I didn't hack your accounts, Richard," I stated, my tone dropping to a deadly and uncompromising whisper. "I froze them as the new legal administrator of Teddy's estate. Oh, and Donovan sent the audit files to the FBI this morning. Enjoy Paris." I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath on the other end of the line. The devastating realization was finally hitting him. freezing the arrogant blood in his veins much faster than the bitter winter blizzard raging outside our windows. He suddenly understood that he was no longer speaking to the discarded, obedient daughter he could easily manipulate and verbally abuse. He was speaking to the legal executioner of his entire fraudulent existence. He realized that the federal government was already reviewing his massive embezzlement trail. "Wait, Gwen, you cannot be serious." Richard stammered, his booming voice instantly cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine of pure panic. "The FBI. Gwen, please, we can talk about this. You do not understand the situation. I am your father, you have to listen to me." I did not wait for his pathetic response to continue. I did not wait for the inevitable torrent of fabricated excuses, desperate pleading, or fresh, empty threats. I had absolutely zero interest in negotiating with a cornered narcissist who had just spent the last decade treating me like disposable garbage. I calmly extended my index finger and pressed the bright red button on the screen, terminating the international call instantly. The line went dead, plunging the den back into a heavy, victorious silence. Then, with two quick, deliberate taps on my digital screen, I pulled up his contact profile and hit block. I effectively cut off his narcissistic supply permanently. By blocking his number, I denied him the one thing a toxic abuser craves more than money or status. I denied him a target. I denied him the opportunity to argue, to gaslight, to manipulate, or to project his own massive failures onto me. I sealed him inside a complete communication void of his own making, leaving him stranded across the Atlantic Ocean with a frozen bank account, a pending federal investigation, and an absolute inability to contact the one person holding the keys to his survival. The sheer psychological devastation of that sudden, impenetrable silence would break him faster than any screaming match ever could. I set the phone face down on the mahogany table and looked up at my grandfather, a cold, flawless victory settling deep into my bones. The silence in the den was absolute, save for the faint crackling of the winter wind rattling the large glass patio doors. Donovan did not offer a congratulatory remark. He simply continued typing on his encrypted tablet, locking down the secondary trust accounts with the same mechanical efficiency he used to dismantle rival corporations. Teddy, however, raised his crystal tumbler toward me in a silent, respectful salute. We had successfully executed the primary phase of the financial embargo. Richard was effectively neutralized. By blocking his direct cellular connection, I had isolated the head of the snake. But a toxic family dynamic rarely relies on a single avenue of attack. When the primary abuser is silenced, the enablers and the sycophants will inevitably attempt to breach the perimeter. It took exactly 8 minutes for the secondary assault to materialize. My phone screen lit up against the dark wood of the coffee table. It was not a standard text message or a blocked call notification. It was a direct message alert from Instagram. I leaned forward and tapped the notification banner, bringing up the application interface. Jada had bypassed the cellular block. As a self-proclaimed luxury lifestyle influencer, she practically lived on social media, treating her digital presence as her primary weapon of mass communication. She had undoubtedly seen Richard panicking in the hotel lobby and immediately retreated to the safety of her digital echo chamber to launch a retaliatory strike. Her message was a frantic, poorly punctuated block of text that radiated pure, unadulterated desperation disguised as aristocratic rage. I read the words displayed on the glowing screen, my expression remaining completely impassive. "You are an absolute psychopath, Gwen." Jada had typed, her digital hysteria bleeding through every single syllable. "Richard just told us what you are trying to do with the bank accounts. You think you can just press a button and steal Cameron's company money to ruin our holiday? You are nothing but an ugly, jealous spinster who cannot stand the fact that her brother is a billionaire while you die alone in a cubicle. Cameron is calling his corporate lawyers right now. You are going to be living on the street by the time we get back to Chicago. Do not ever contact us again, you miserable freak." I stared at the screen, a dark and genuine amusement sparking in my chest. It was a fascinating psychological phenomenon. Jada was standing in the epicenter of a massive financial collapse, completely stranded in a foreign country, without a single functioning credit card, and her immediate instinct was to protect her fragile ego by hurling middle school insults at the woman holding the executioner's axe. She was still clinging desperately to the manufactured illusion of Cameron's limitless wealth. She genuinely believed her husband was a tech titan who could simply summon a team of high-priced attorneys to crush me. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. Anger requires an emotional investment, and I had completely divested from this family years ago. I did not type out a lengthy defensive paragraph justifying my actions. I did not engage in a petty digital screaming match with a woman whose entire net worth was currently tied up in unpaid leased vehicles and maxed-out department store credit cards. In the world of high-stakes corporate warfare, you do not argue with a hostile liability. You simply present them with the undeniable catastrophic data and let the reality of their own ruin crush them. I turned my attention back to my encrypted laptop screen. I accessed the secure folder containing the deep dive background checks I had run on my brother's fraudulent tech empire earlier that morning. With 2 swift clicks of my trackpad, I isolated the exact legal documents that would permanently shatter Jada's pristine, carefully curated reality. The first document was the official federally stamped Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing for Novatech Solutions dated exactly 24 months ago. It explicitly detailed Cameron's total insolvency, his massive defaulted loans, and the complete liquidation of his non-existent software assets. The second document was a certified commercial repossession order from a high-line automotive leasing firm in Chicago. It clearly listed the vehicle identification number for Jada's prized Porsche Macan, noting that the account was 90 days in arrears and authorizing immediate towing and impoundment of the vehicle. I downloaded the 2 highly sensitive PDF files directly to my mobile device. I opened the Instagram application, navigated back to the direct message thread containing her venomous, unhinged rant, and tapped the attachment icon. I did not include a snarky caption. I did not add a single emoji or a cruel parting word. The raw, unfiltered financial data was infinitely more devastating than any insult I could possibly formulate. I selected the bankruptcy filing. I selected the Porsche repossession order. I pressed send. The 2 digital files uploaded instantly, appearing as crisp, undeniable icons in the chat history right beneath her pathetic paragraph of insults. I set the phone back down on the table, keeping the screen illuminated. I leaned back into the leather sofa and watched the bottom right corner of the digital chat interface. In the world of social media, ignorance is never a viable defense. The platform's tracking mechanics guarantee absolute visibility. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The silence in the den was thick with anticipation. Teddy watched me from his wingback chair, recognizing the lethal, quiet patience of a hunter waiting for the trap to snap shut. Then it happened. Right beneath the 2 PDF attachments, a tiny, faint gray text materialized on the screen. Read. I smiled, the cold satisfaction settling deeply into my veins. Jada had opened the messages. She was standing in that $3,000 a night suite at the Ritz Paris, staring at the glowing screen of her phone, reading the federal documentation that proved her billionaire husband was an absolute fraud. She was currently looking at the legal proof that her luxury car was actively being hunted by repo men back in Chicago. Her entire manufactured identity, her marriage, her wealth, her social media empire, it was all violently dissolving in the palms of her hands. The illusion was completely shattered. The money was gone, and she was trapped in a hotel room with a man who had been lying to her since the day they met. I did not need to be in France to see the fallout. I knew exactly what was coming next. The explosion in that Paris hotel room was absolutely imminent. I did not need a live video feed to watch the absolute devastation unfold. The digital footprint flashing across my forensic accounting software told the entire humiliating story in real time. In the world of ultra-luxury hospitality, institutions like the Ritz Paris do not operate on polite leniency when a client's financial standing suddenly evaporates into thin air. They operate with ruthless velvet-gloved efficiency, and I knew exactly how this particular corporate mechanism worked. It started with a simple automated alert on my screen. The Ritz Paris daily room rate and the accumulated room service folio attempted its routine midday authorization against Richard's primary platinum card. The transaction hit the federal fraud block attorney Donovan and I had meticulously constructed just hours prior. The system returned a hard, undeniable denial. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hands, watching the cascade of data with cold, clinical satisfaction. 5 minutes later, the hotel's accounting department attempted a secondary authorization on the backup credit card my mother had proudly provided at check-in. Another hard denial. In that opulent $3,000 a night suite, the heavy brass telephone resting on the antique writing desk would have rung with a soft, demanding chime. Richard, likely still pacing the imported rugs and fuming over his complete inability to reach me, would have snatched up the receiver, fully expecting the hotel concierge to offer a groveling apology for the banking error. Instead, he would be greeted by the crisp, uncompromising voice of the hotel's senior duty manager. The manager would politely inform him that the payment methods on file were entirely invalid, and that the outstanding balance for the vintage champagne, the room service caviar, and the suite itself required immediate alternative settlement. I watched a third authorization attempt pop up on my glowing monitor. This one was for a significantly smaller amount, originating from Cameron's supposedly bottomless corporate expense account. Richard was clearly desperate, demanding the hotel try his son's card to clear the immediate debt and save face. Declined. Account frozen. That was the exact moment the velvet gloves came off. The Ritz Paris does not tolerate insolvent guests occupying their premier suites, especially during the highly lucrative holiday season. The protocol for this level of financial delinquency is swift, discreet, and utterly merciless. A sharp knock would echo through the suite. It would not be the eager room service attendant delivering fresh towels or expensive truffles. It would be the senior duty manager, flanked by two imposing members of the hotel's private security team. They would step into the room, their expressions carved from pure ice. The manager would not raise his voice. He would not engage in a petty argument or listen to Richard's arrogant bluster. He would simply hand my father a printed folio of their exorbitant unpaid charges and deliver the devastating ultimatum. They had exactly 1 hour to provide a valid, verifiable wire transfer, or they had to vacate the premises immediately. My laptop screen remained perfectly still. There were no new transaction attempts. They had absolutely nothing left to swipe. The panic inside that suite would be absolute and suffocating. Brenda would be screeching about the sheer indignity of it all, frantically tossing her newly acquired designer clothing into her expensive suitcases while demanding Richard fix the problem. Jada, armed with the devastating PDF files I had just sent her, would turn her full unhinged fury onto Cameron. The golden child, completely stripped of his fake billionaire armor, would be stammering pathetic excuses, while his wife packed her bags, screaming about his hidden bankruptcy and his monumental lies. The illusion of family unity was burning to the ground in a foreign country, incinerated by the harsh light of their own financial ruin. 60 minutes later, the digital checkout sequence registered on the hotel's primary ledger on my screen. But the humiliation was far from over. As my family attempted to make their grand, indignant exit through the gilded lobby, trailing their massive collection of Louis Vuitton and Gucci luggage, the security team would seamlessly block their path to the revolving glass doors. I knew the strict international hospitality laws regarding unpaid debts. The Ritz was well within its legal rights to protect its financial interests against high-flight risk guests. The duty manager would step forward, his voice cutting clearly through the sophisticated murmur of the lobby. He would calmly explain that until the outstanding balance of their stay was settled in full, the hotel was legally seizing their luggage as collateral. I could almost hear Brenda's shrill, aristocratic screech echoing off the crystal chandeliers. She would loudly threaten to sue the establishment. Richard would puff out his chest, his face turning an ugly shade of purple, and demand to speak to the regional owners. But bluster holds zero currency when your bank accounts are locked by the federal government. The security guards would efficiently confiscate every single piece of heavy luggage, peeling the designer bags right out of their manicured hands without a shred of hesitation. They were entirely stripped of their stolen armor. They were allowed to keep only the small personal carry-on bags slung over their shoulders. Everything else, the Cartier jewelry, the custom-tailored suits, the expensive Parisian souvenirs bought with Teddy's retirement funds, was locked away in the hotel's secure holding vault. The polished brass doors of the Ritz opened, and my family was unceremoniously expelled from the palace. They stepped out into the freezing, relentless Parisian rain. There was no private town car waiting for them at the curb. There was no luxury chauffeur holding an umbrella to whisk them away to an exclusive dining reservation. They stood on the wet pavement, shivering in the bitter winter wind, completely surrounded by the staggering wealth of the city they could no longer afford to participate in. Richard pulled out his phone, his hands likely trembling from a mixture of impotent rage and hypothermia, desperately searching for a place they could afford, using the meager legitimate pocket cash Jada still possessed. The reality of their new existence was harsh and immediate. They were not heading to another five-star resort. They were looking for the cheapest, most obscure hostel on the outskirts of the city, just to keep a roof over their heads for the night. To get there, the Golden family, who had spent decades looking down their noses at anyone who did not possess a country club membership, had only one viable option. They had to turn their backs on the glowing luxury boutiques, walk down the wet, filthy concrete stairs, and descend into the crowded subterranean depths of the public subway system. Their aristocratic illusion was completely and permanently shattered. While they were navigating the grimy underbelly of Paris, I remained perfectly comfortable in the warm, mahogany-lined den back in Chicago. Donovan was packing up his heavy leather briefcase, the complex legal lifting complete, when a different kind of notification chimed loudly on my laptop. This one did not originate from an international banking syndicate or a federal fraud database. It was a standard high-priority alert from Facebook. I had muted my mother's social media accounts years ago, but I kept an automated tracker active for any posts tagging my specific name. In the corporate world, managing public relations during a hostile takeover is just as critical as freezing the financial assets. I knew Brenda would not stay silent. A narcissist stripped of her money will immediately pivot to her only remaining currency, which is public sympathy and social manipulation. I clicked the notification banner and mirrored my laptop screen to the large, smart television mounted above the stone fireplace so Teddy could see exactly what we were dealing with. Brenda had crafted an absolute masterpiece of digital manipulation. It was a lengthy, multi-paragraph status update, complete with a heavily filtered, tragic-looking selfie of her and Richard standing in what appeared to be a rainy, desolate European transit station. The caption beneath the photo was a textbook masterclass in aggressive gaslighting and weaponized victimhood. Friends and family, please send your deepest prayers. I read aloud, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet room. We are currently experiencing an unimaginable family tragedy. My estranged daughter Gwendolyn has suffered a severe and sudden psychiatric break. While Richard and I are stranded overseas dealing with a catastrophic banking error she maliciously engineered, she has stolen our entire life savings. Worse still, she has completely abandoned my dying, helpless father in an unheated house. We are terrified for his physical safety and her mental state. If anyone is in the Chicago area, please send the police to our estate to rescue my father from this unhinged girl. Teddy let out a short, incredulous bark of laughter, shaking his head at the glowing television screen. She is asking her country club friends to send a police SWAT team to rescue the man she just stole $4 million from. The absolute sheer audacity of that woman is breathtaking. I scrolled down to the comment section, which was already exploding with frantic engagement. The rapid influx of responses perfectly illustrated the toxic, carefully curated narrative my mother had spent decades building. She had not just started lying about me today. She had been deliberately laying the groundwork for this exact moment for my entire life. The comments from her elite country club circle poured in, dripping with performative outrage and aggressive, cloying sympathy. Brenda, I am so devastated for you. wrote a woman named Beatrice, the reigning president of the local homeowners association. You have tried so incredibly hard with that girl. I always knew there was something deeply wrong with her when she refused to attend the debutante ball. She always carried such a dark, bitter energy. Another comment from a wealthy society matron named Susan followed immediately, sending heavy prayers to Richard and Brenda. You gave that ungrateful, difficult child everything a daughter could ever want, and she repays you with literal madness. Stay strong. I read through dozens of similar comments. They called me a problem child. They called me a jealous, miserable spinster who simply could not handle my brother Cameron's brilliant fictional success. They fiercely praised Brenda as a martyr, a saint of a mother who had endured endless suffering at the hands of a sociopathic daughter. Every single comment was a direct reflection of the insidious, quiet poison Brenda had been dripping into their ears over expensive martinis and tennis matches for 20 years. Whenever I missed a family dinner because I was closing a massive corporate merger in New York, Brenda told them I was depressed and antisocial. Whenever I declined to participate in their shallow suburban drama, she spun my absence as mental instability. She had proactively built an echo chamber of wealthy, bored enablers who were perfectly primed to attack me the second she gave the command. She is trying to aggressively control the narrative, Donovan observed, standing near the doorway with his cashmere overcoat draped over his arm. She is creating a public record of your supposed mental incompetence. If she can convince a sympathetic judge that you are having a severe psychiatric episode, she will attempt to have the emergency asset transfers invalidated and the power of attorney permanently revoked. It is a desperate, sloppy legal strategy. It is only going to work if we let her control the microphone, I replied, my eyes locked on the rapidly scrolling comments. She made a massive, fatal tactical error, Donovan. She assumed I would react highly emotionally to this public shaming. She assumed I would jump into the comment section, aggressively defend myself, sound incredibly frantic, and inadvertently prove her fake narrative of mental instability. In a corporate public relations war, you do not argue with a hostile entity in a highly public forum. You do not explain yourself to their brainwashed sycophants. You simply drop the undeniable catastrophic proof and walk away, letting the blast wave completely level their entire reputation. I highlighted a particularly nasty comment from a woman named Margaret, the wife of the bank executive who had originally helped Richard set up his accounts. Brenda, we are mobilizing right now. We are calling the local precinct to request an immediate wellness check on Teddy. We will not let that unstable girl harm your father. Stay safe in Paris, darling. The irony was thick enough to choke on. They were aggressively rallying to protect Teddy from the exact person who had just saved him from absolute financial ruin. They are calling the police, I noted, pointing at Margaret's comment on the television screen. Donovan checked his platinum wristwatch. Let them call. I have already dispatched a legal courier to the local precinct with a certified copy of the master deeds, your power of attorney, and the preliminary federal fraud injunctions against Richard and Brenda. When the patrol cars arrive at the front gate tonight, they will not be coming to arrest you for elder abuse. They will be arriving to officially verify that the property has been legally secured against a hostile threat. Perfect, I said, turning my focus back to the glowing laptop screen. The battlefield was set. The legal perimeter was heavily fortified. Now it was time to execute the social annihilation. I navigated to the audio file I had extracted from the earlier video call. I checked the waveform on my editing software to ensure the volume levels were completely optimized. I wanted every single one of Brenda's wealthy, judgmental country club friends to hear the absolute clarity of her vile arrogance. I wanted them to hear the distinct metallic clinking of her newly purchased diamond tennis bracelet as she waved her hand and ordered me to act as an unpaid maid. I wanted them to hear the sneering contempt in her voice when she called her own father a dying old man who was nothing more than a stressful burden on her luxurious lifestyle. This audio file was not just a piece of evidence. It was a digital guillotine. I dragged the unedited media file directly into the main reply thread of Brenda's tragic, highly engaged status update. I did not add a defensive paragraph. I did not type out an emotional plea for understanding. I simply attached the raw, unfiltered truth. I hovered my finger over the enter key, fully prepared to drop the ultimate receipt and watch her pristine, fabricated social empire burn straight to the ground. I pressed the enter key with a sharp, definitive strike. The unedited audio file uploaded instantly, locking itself permanently into the comment section right beneath my mother's pathetic filtered selfie. I did not add a single word of text. In the business of hostile takeovers, you never distract from the primary evidence with unnecessary exposition. You present the undeniable data and step back to let the market react. I mirrored the live feed from my laptop directly onto the massive television screen above the fireplace, so my grandfather and Donovan could watch the social execution unfold in real time. The digital play counter on the audio file sat at 0 for exactly 10 seconds. Then it ticked to 1, then 5, then 50. Within 2 minutes, over 100 of Brenda's elite hand-picked country club friends had clicked the play button. They were expecting to hear a voicemail of me screaming or some fabricated proof of my supposed mental breakdown. Instead, the pristine acoustics of the den were filled with the crystal-clear, high-definition playback of Brenda's own shrill, venomous voice. The audio quality was flawless. Every single word was a fatal blow to her meticulously crafted persona. The recording blasted her arrogant complaints about the burden of elder care, her vile dismissal of the man who had funded her entire privileged existence, and the ultimate damning admission of her financial crimes. Do you have any idea how stressful it is managing a dying old man every single day? Brenda's recorded voice hissed through the speakers, dripping with unapologetic malice. We took that money because we deserved it after dealing with his pathetic decline. Do your basic duty for once in your miserable life and do not call this number again unless Teddy stops breathing entirely. The sound of her heavy diamond tennis bracelet clinking against the phone microphone served as the perfect sickening percussion to her confession of theft and abuse. Teddy leaned back in his wingback chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. That is the sound of a woman signing her own social death warrant, he remarked, his tone devoid of any pity. On the screen, the response was not immediate. The sheer shock of the audio file had temporarily paralyzed her entire echo chamber. For 3 agonizingly long minutes, no one typed a single word. They were collectively processing the horrifying reality that the woman they had just spent the last hour vigorously defending was actually a ruthless, abusive criminal. Then the digital dam broke. The first comment materialized from Barbara, the wife of the bank executive, who had previously promised to send a police SWAT team to rescue my grandfather. Her previous sympathetic post vanished instantly, replaced by a frantic, horrified response. Brenda, is this your voice? Did you just admit to stealing your own father's money and wishing for his death? I am physically sick to my stomach. The domino effect was instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic. The tide of public opinion did not just turn. It violently inverted into a tsunami of absolute disgust. Beatrice, the reigning president of the local homeowners association and the ultimate gatekeeper of suburban high society, struck next. Her digital tone shifted from cloying sympathy to absolute unyielding fury. You lied to all of us. Beatrice typed her comment, accumulating dozens of likes in mere seconds. You sat at my dining table drinking my wine and told me Gwendolyn was unstable. Yet here you are on tape admitting to federal elder abuse while gallivanting around Europe. Do not ever speak to me or my family again. You are a monster. I hit the refresh button. The comment section was a bloodbath. Dozens of mutual friends, extended relatives, and corporate acquaintances were aggressively deleting their previous messages of support. They were rapidly replacing them with harsh, unforgiving condemnations. The very people Brenda had spent 2 decades grooming to despise me were now turning their collective wrath entirely onto her. They called her a parasite. They called her a criminal. They expressed profound horror that she had abandoned an 82-year-old man in a freezing house just to buy designer bags in France. The absolute hypocrisy of her original post begging for prayers while she was actively committing federal fraud enraged them beyond measure. Then came the ultimate fatal blow. Harriet Kensington, the formidable chairwoman of the highly exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club Board of Directors, entered the chat. The country club was Brenda's entire universe. It was the absolute pinnacle of her social identity. Losing her standing there was equivalent to a total excommunication from polite society. Harriet did not mince words. She delivered the social execution with the cold administrative precision of a military strike. Brenda, the executive board, has been made aware of this audio recording. Harriet wrote her comment instantly pinned to the top by the sheer volume of engagement. The Oak Ridge Country Club maintains strict moral and ethical guidelines for all its members. Based on your own explicit admission of elder abuse and financial theft against Theodore, a founding member of this very institution, your membership is hereby revoked with immediate effect. Your locker will be cleared out by staff tomorrow morning. Do not attempt to access the grounds. I sat back and watched the screen, a profound and icy satisfaction settling deep into my chest. Brenda was currently wandering the wet, grimy streets of Paris, desperately searching for a cheap hostel with a declined credit card and a ruined husband. She had absolutely no access to the internet. She had no idea that her entire social empire was currently burning to ash in front of thousands of people. By the time she finally managed to secure a public Wi-Fi connection, she would be logging into a completely decimated reality. In less than 10 minutes, her carefully curated social standing was entirely obliterated. She was no longer the wealthy, suffering matriarch of an elite suburban family. She was a publicly confirmed, socially exiled criminal. I closed the browser window. The social media war was officially over, and my mother had suffered a total, unrecoverable defeat. Now it was time to prepare for the physical fallout at the airport. I remained seated in the dim glow of my laptop screen, tracking the digital breadcrumbs of their desperate retreat. After being unceremoniously ejected from the Ritz, my family had vanished from the financial grid for a few hours. They were undoubtedly navigating the maze of the Parisian public transit system, a harsh and unforgiving reality for four arrogant people, accustomed to private chauffeurs. Then a new notification chimed on my monitor. The geographical ping registered directly at a ticketing counter inside Terminal 2 of Charles de Gaulle Airport. It was a transaction alert from a basic low-limit debit card. It was the only piece of plastic in their possession that had not been frozen by Donovan's federal injunctions because it was Jada's personal account. It held the meager scattered ad revenue she had scraped together from her minor social media sponsorships. I leaned back and pictured the miserable scene unfolding at the international departure desk. They would be soaking wet from the freezing Parisian rain, their designer coats ruined, dragging their pitiful carry-on bags. Richard, entirely stripped of his wealth and his booming country club authority, would have been forced to stand aside while Jada approached the counter to negotiate their survival. Buying 4 last-minute one-way transatlantic tickets on a holiday weekend is an astronomical expense. I watched the live ledger as the airline authorized the charge. The transaction instantly wiped out 98% of Jada's entire personal savings, leaving her with a pathetic 2-digit balance. That was the exact moment the fragile manufactured piece finally shattered. The transaction approval receipt printing at the counter was the undeniable physical proof that her billionaire husband was entirely useless. Jada had just emptied her own bank account to save a man who had lied to her since the day they met. I knew my sister-in-law's volatile temperament. She did not possess the emotional regulation to wait until they were in private to address a betrayal of this magnitude. Right there in the middle of one of the busiest international airports on the planet, Jada turned to face my brother, completely disregarding the thousands of travelers surrounding them. She pulled out her phone, the screen displaying the PDF files I had sent her earlier. The official Chapter 7, corporate bankruptcy filing for Novatech Solutions, and the aggressive repossession order for her leased luxury SUV. "You lied to me!" Jada screamed, her voice echoing sharply against the high-vaulted ceilings of the terminal. Cameron, the golden child, who had been insulated from every consequence, his entire life instantly shrank back. He looked around frantically, his face burning with a hot, terrified flush as hundreds of strangers turned to stare at the escalating spectacle. He desperately tried to shush her, raising his hands in a pathetic, placating gesture, begging her to keep her voice down and discuss it at the boarding gate. But Jada was completely unhinged. She shoved his hands away, stepping directly into his personal space. "You are a broke, pathetic fraud," she shrieked, waving the phone directly in his face. "You told me you were a tech CEO. You told me your company was worth millions. Your business went bankrupt 2 years ago, Cameron. You do not even own the car I drive. Your psychotic sister just sent me the legal repossession orders. They are towing my Porsche right now because you cannot even afford a basic monthly lease." The absolute humiliation on Cameron's face was total and inescapable. He had no defense. There was no clever tech jargon he could use to spin the reality of his own absolute insolvency. He was standing in a wet coat, completely publicly exposed as a hollow, financially ruined liar. Brenda, completely incapable of watching her precious son be verbally annihilated, made a massive tactical error. She stepped forward, attempting to utilize her usual domineering aristocratic authority to silence her daughter-in-law. She ordered Jada to lower her voice and stop causing a dramatic scene over a simple financial misunderstanding. Jada turned her blazing, unadulterated fury onto Brenda. "Do not you dare tell me to lower my voice, you absolute criminal!" Jada roared, pointing a manicured finger directly at Brenda's chest. "You are wearing a stolen Chanel coat. You funded this entire fake vacation by robbing a dying old man blind. Your country club friends just tore you to shreds on Facebook. You are going to federal prison, Brenda, and I am not going down with your disgusting, fraudulent family." The word criminal echoed across the ticketing lobby. In an international airport, screaming about fraud and stolen money is a guaranteed way to attract immediate armed intervention. The heavy, methodical sound of combat boots approached rapidly. A squad of the French gendarmerie, the heavily armed military police assigned to airport security, marched directly into the center of the dispute. They did not care about suburban American entitlement. They did not care about Richard's former corporate status. They surrounded the four of them, hands resting intimidatingly on their tactical belts, demanding to see their passports, and aggressively ordering them to cease the public disturbance immediately or face detainment. I watched the flight registry update on my screen. Richard had to swallow every single ounce of his towering pride. He had to stammer out a pathetic, broken apology to the armed officers, pleading with them in fragmented English to simply let them board their flight back to Chicago. The officers checked their travel documents, issued a harsh, uncompromising verbal warning, and ordered them to proceed directly to the security checkpoint without another word. They had narrowly avoided a foreign jail cell, but their punishment was far from over. Because Jada had purchased the absolute cheapest last-minute standby tickets available with her depleted savings, they were subjected to the cruelest reality of commercial air travel. There were no first-class pods waiting for them. There was no priority boarding or complimentary champagne. The airline system updated their seating assignments, and I let out a dark, highly satisfied laugh. They were assigned 4 middle seats in the absolute back row of economy class, the seats that do not recline. The seats located directly adjacent to the heavily trafficked economy lavatories. The facade of the perfect marriage was violently ripped apart. The golden child was exposed as a complete failure. The wealthy matriarch was a confirmed thief. They were forced to march onto that plain strip off their wet, stolen designer coats and cram themselves into tiny, restrictive middle seats. They would have to sit shoulder to shoulder, pressed against the very people they now absolutely despised with every fiber of their being. They were locked in a pressurized metal tube for a grueling 9-hour transatlantic flight, simmering in a toxic stew of pure, venomous hatred for each other with absolutely nowhere to run and nothing waiting for them at home but a locked door and a police siren. The flight tracker application on my secondary monitor confirmed that the commercial airliner had officially reached cruising altitude over the Atlantic Ocean. I watched the tiny digital airplane icon inch its way across the blue map on my screen. They were completely disconnected from the terrestrial grid. They had no cellular service, no internet access, and absolutely zero capacity to intervene in the physical world for the next 8.5 hours. It was the perfect, uninterrupted operational window. In the corporate restructuring business, when you acquire a toxic asset, You do not politely ask the former executive board to pack up their personal desk items. You send in a liquidation team box up their belongings in standard cardboard and escort them out of the building. I was about to apply that exact same methodology to my childhood home. I picked up my phone and dialed a premium commercial junk removal and estate liquidation service based out of downtown Chicago. I had utilized their highly discreet services several times before when clearing out foreclosed commercial properties. They operated with ruthless military precision, asking absolutely no questions, and working at a blistering pace. I authorized a premium rush fee using my newly secured administrative accounts. I informed the dispatcher that I required a full interior purge of personal effects from a $4 million residential estate and I needed the crew on site within the hour. 60 minutes later, two massive unmarked box trucks backed up the snow-covered driveway. A crew of 8 men in matching gray uniforms stepped out into the freezing wind. The foreman, a hulking man with a clipboard, walked up the front steps. I stood in the grand foyer holding a steaming mug of black coffee and handed him a signed legal waiver alongside a floor plan of the house. I had highlighted the master suite and the East Wing guest room in bright red marker. I want every single piece of clothing, every personal item, every toiletry, and every luxury accessory boxed up, I instructed, my voice perfectly level. Do not bother with careful folding or bubble wrap. Just get it into the boxes, tape them shut, and load them into the trucks. You are clearing the master bedroom and the room at the end of the East Hall. You have 4 hours to strip those rooms down to the bare drywall. The foreman gave a sharp nod, signaled his crew, and the physical eradication of my family officially began. I followed the crew up the grand curving staircase and stood in the doorway of the master suite. This massive room had always been Brenda and Richard's inner sanctum, a monument to their own vanity. The walk-in closets were the size of studio apartments. I watched with deep, unyielding satisfaction as the liquidation crew aggressively swept their arms across the heavy wooden racks. Brenda's expensive cashmere sweaters, her silk blouses, and her racks of designer shoes were unceremoniously dumped into heavy-duty brown cardboard boxes. The expensive garments she had weaponized to establish her country club dominance were treated exactly like worthless industrial scrap. Richard's bespoke Italian suits met the exact same fate. The custom-tailored jackets he wore to intimidate board members and project false wealth were shoved into boxes and sealed with loud ripping strips of industrial packing tape. They were dismantling the physical evidence of my parents' fake aristocracy minute by minute. I walked down the hall to the East Wing and pushed open the door to Cameron's childhood bedroom. Even though he supposedly owned a luxury penthouse downtown, Brenda had preserved this room like a sacred museum dedicated to the golden child. The shelves were lined with his participation trophies, framed newspaper clippings of his fabricated tech startup launch, and expensive electronics bought with stolen money. I pointed at the shelves. Take it all, I commanded the crew member standing nearby. Sweep the shelves into the trash bags, leave absolutely nothing behind. Watching them dismantle the shrine to the golden child was profoundly cathartic. The physical manifestation of the familial hierarchy that had crushed me for decades was being efficiently thrown into a garbage bag. By 2 in the afternoon, the trucks were completely loaded. Every trace of their existence had been packed away. I handed the foreman a printed address sheet. I had not rented a climate-controlled premium storage facility for their luxury goods. I had booked a cheap, unheated, grimy industrial storage unit situated right next to the roaring interstate on the absolute outskirts of the city limits. I paid for exactly 1 month of rent in advance. I handed the foreman the heavy brass padlock I had purchased from a local hardware store. Unload the boxes into Unit 412, lock the roll-up door, and bring the key back to me, I ordered. While the liquidation crew drove off to dump the remains of my family's life, the second phase of my security protocol arrived at the estate. A high-end commercial locksmith van pulled up to the front doors. If my parents thought they were going to use their old brass keys to simply walk back into this house and scream at me, they were severely mistaken. I instructed the technicians to completely remove the old traditional locking mechanisms on every single exterior door. The heavy mahogany front doors were retrofitted with commercial-grade biometric smart locks featuring reinforced steel strike plates. The perimeter security system was entirely wiped reset and linked directly to my personal mobile device. Every old access code, every garage door remote, and every spare key was instantly rendered entirely useless. I was the only human being on the planet who possessed the digital credentials to bypass the new security perimeter. As the sun began to set, casting long, freezing shadows across the snow-covered lawn, the contractors finished their work and departed. I locked the new deadbolts with a satisfying heavy electronic click from my phone. I walked slowly through the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing against the Italian marble. I moved up the curving staircase and stood in the hallway, looking into the master suite and the east wing bedroom. The spaces were totally barren. The closets were completely empty. The shelves were stripped bare. The suffocating toxic presence that had haunted this property for my entire life had been aggressively scrubbed clean. The $4 million house was completely legally and physically purged of their existence. The flight tracker on my secondary monitor blinked, signaling that the transatlantic commercial flight had officially touched down on the icy tarmac at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. I checked the digital clock resting on the edge of my desktop. It was nearly midnight. Outside the heavily fortified walls of the estate, the temperature had plummeted well below zero, the bitter wind howling violently through the bare winter trees. I remained seated in the den, sipping a fresh cup of black coffee, watching the GPS ping from Jada's mobile device update its location in real time. They had finally arrived. I could perfectly visualize their absolute misery as they navigated the crowded, depressing international arrivals terminal. There was no VIP expedited customs lane waiting for them. There was no polite chauffeur holding a glossy placard bearing our family name ready to whisk them away in a heated luxury town car. Instead, they were forced to stand in the endless winding lines with hundreds of exhausted travelers, wearing their wrinkled, damp clothing from the freezing Parisian rain. They carried only their small personal carry-on bags. The physical absence of their confiscated designer luggage served as a heavy, continuous reminder of their total financial collapse. Jada's location ping moved from the terminal building to the designated public transportation pickup zone. I watched the digital icon crawl slowly down the interstate. They had been forced to hail a standard cheap city taxi. My father, a man who regularly threw raging tantrums if his private driver arrived 2 minutes late, was currently crammed into the back seat of a smelly, unheated sedan. He was undoubtedly jammed shoulder to shoulder with Cameron and Brenda, while Jada sat rigidly in the front passenger seat, staring out the window into the pitch-black night. The tension inside that miserable vehicle would be absolutely suffocating. Richard was likely grinding his teeth, his massive ego severely bruised but rapidly converting into explosive directed anger. In his arrogant, delusional mind, he still believed he was the absolute patriarch of this family. He genuinely thought he was going to pull up to the estate, march through the front doors, and scream me into total submission. He planned to use his booming voice and aggressive physical posturing to bully me into reversing the bank freezes. He fully expected me to cower in the foyer, apologize for my insubordination, and hand him back the keys to the kingdom. He thought he could simply reclaim his territory through sheer unadulterated intimidation. He was operating under the obsolete assumption that I was still the discarded daughter begging for his approval. He did not comprehend that he was dealing with the new legal administrator of his entire reality. The digital icon on my screen took the final turn onto our exclusive suburban street. I closed the tracking application and switched my monitor over to the high-definition exterior security camera feeds. The new system I had installed that afternoon featured military-grade night vision and crystal-clear audio recording capabilities. I leaned back in the leather chair waiting. Beside me, Teddy sat in quiet anticipation, a dark, satisfied smile playing across his lips as he watched the glowing screen. A battered yellow taxi pulled up to the curb just outside the imposing wrought iron security gates of the estate. The harsh glare of the streetlights illuminated the heavy snowfall whipping around the vehicle. The rear doors popped open and my family spilled out onto the frozen, unshoveled pavement. They looked completely pathetic. Brenda was shivering violently, her thin luxury travel cardigan offering zero protection against the brutal Chicago winter wind. Cameron looked utterly defeated, dragging his feet in expensive loafers that were immediately ruined by the harsh road salt and gray slush. Jada did not even look at her husband. She slammed the taxi door shut and marched straight toward the pedestrian entry gate, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The taxi immediately sped off into the night, leaving them stranded at the edge of the property line. Richard marched up to the primary vehicle gate, his posture rigid with furious intent. He did not look like a broken man yet. He looked like a hostile executive preparing to fire an insubordinate employee. He reached out with a bare, freezing hand and aggressively punched his personalized 6-digit access code into the brass security keypad mounted on the stone pillar. He expected the heavy iron gates to smoothly swing open, welcoming the master of the house back to his fortress. Instead, the digital keypad let out a sharp, harsh electronic buzz. A bright, solid red light flashed aggressively across the interface. Access denied. I watched Richard's face contort in genuine confusion on the security monitor. He paused, rubbed his freezing hands together, and leaned closer to the keypad, assuming his numb fingers had simply slipped on the buttons. He punched the 6-digit code in a second time, striking the keys with much more force. Buzz. The red light flashed again. Brenda stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her shivering torso. Her breath formed thick white clouds in the freezing air. "What is wrong with it, Richard?" She snapped, her voice carrying clearly through the high-definition exterior microphones. "Open the gate. I am freezing to death out here." "There is ice on the sensor," Richard growled back, his patience instantly evaporating. He aggressively slammed his palm against the side of the metal call box. He inputted Brenda's backup access code. Buzz, red light. He frantically typed in Cameron's security code. Buzz, red light. The horrific realization began to slowly creep across their freezing faces. This was not a mechanical malfunction. This was not a weather-related electrical glitch. The physical barrier standing between them and the warmth of the $4 million mansion was directly mirroring the absolute financial barrier I had erected around their bank accounts. The entire perimeter had been compromised and rewritten. They were entirely locked out of their own lives. Jada let out a loud, mocking laugh that cut through the howling wind. "She completely changed the locks," Jada yelled, directing her absolute venom at Cameron. "Your psychotic sister locked us out of the house. We are standing in a blizzard with no luggage and no money because your family is completely insane." "Shut up, Jada!" Richard roared, his carefully maintained corporate composure finally snapping into millions of jagged pieces. He lunged forward, grabbing the freezing wrought iron bars of the gate with both of his bare hands. He began shaking the heavy metal structure violently, the thick iron rattling loudly against the stone pillars. "Gwen," he screamed at the top of his lungs, his booming voice echoing furiously down the quiet, elite suburban street. "Open this gate right now. I know you are in there. You open this gate, or I will break these windows and drag you out by your hair." I watched him through the monitor, perfectly safe inside my heated, impenetrable fortress. Richard continued pounding violently on the wrought iron gates in the freezing snow, completely unaware that his screaming was not a display of power, but the absolute confirmation of his total defeat. I watched the pathetic spectacle on the security monitor for a full 2 minutes. Richard was red-faced and panting, his bare hands raw from slamming against the frozen iron. Brenda was huddled against Cameron, sobbing dramatically into his ruined designer coat. Jada stood apart from them all, looking at her phone as if expecting a rescue that would never come. They were broken, shivering, and completely out of options. It was time to face them. Not to negotiate, not to argue, but to deliver the final execution. I stood up, adjusting the thick, luxurious cashmere wrap I had draped over my shoulders. It was a beautiful, dove-gray piece, incredibly warm and unashamedly expensive, a tangible reminder of the financial security I had built for myself, while they were busy squandering my grandfather's legacy. I picked up my favorite ceramic mug filled with freshly steeped Earl Grey tea, the steam curling invitingly in the cool air of the foyer. Ready, Teddy asked quietly from the doorway of the den. I turned to look at him. He was no longer the frail, confused old man they had left behind. He stood tall and commanding, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that fit his still formidable frame perfectly. His expression was a mask of cold, unyielding judgment. He looked like the ruthless tycoon who had built an empire ready to crush a rebellious subsidiary. "I am ready," I replied. "Let us show them exactly who they are dealing with." I walked to the massive double doors, bypassing the keypad. I pressed the heavy brass handle and pulled the door open, stepping out onto the expansive covered porch. The bitter wind immediately whipped at my cashmere wrap, but the radiant heat from the mug in my hands kept the chill at bay. The heavy thud of this door opening cut through the howling wind. Richard froze, his fist raised for another strike against the iron bars. Brenda gasped, her tear-streaked face snapping toward the porch. Cameron and Jada simply stared, their expressions a mix of confusion and mounting dread. I stood at the top of the wide stone steps, looking down at them through the bars of the security gate. I did not say a word. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to acknowledge the absolute power dynamic that had just shifted. Gwen Richard roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and desperate relief. "Open this damn gate right now, I am freezing to death. You have lost your mind. I am calling the police." "You can call whoever you like, Richard," I said, my voice carrying easily over the wind, cold and flat. "But I suggest you save your phone battery. You are going to need it to find a cheap motel for the night." "What are you talking about?" Brenda shrieked, pushing past Cameron to grip the freezing iron bars. "This is our house. You cannot lock us out. We are your family." "This house belongs to the legal title holder," I corrected, taking another sip of tea. "And as of yesterday morning, that title holder is me." "That is impossible," Richard shouted, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. "You do not have the authority I have. Medical power of attorney. Teddy is incapacitated. I make the decisions." He was clinging so desperately to his fraudulent legal shield, completely unaware that it had already been obliterated. I did not answer him. I simply stepped aside. From the shadows of the grand foyer, Teddy walked out onto the porch. He moved with slow, deliberate precision, his posture impeccably straight, his sharp gray eyes locking onto his son with an intensity that could shatter glass. He stopped beside me, looking down at the pathetic, shivering group stranded in the snow. The reaction was instantaneous and absolute. Richard staggered backward, his hands falling away from the iron bars as if he had been burned. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly, sickly gray. Brenda let out a choked, terrified gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Even Cameron and Jada seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, their eyes widening in sheer horror. The realization hit them like a runaway freight train. The man standing before them was not confused. He was not incontinent. He was not suffering from advanced dementia. He was entirely lucid, aggressively aware, and visibly furious. The entire foundation of their theft, the very premise of their fraudulent power of attorney, evaporated into thin air in front of their eyes. "Dad," Richard whispered, his voice trembling, stripped of all its former bluster. Teddy looked down at his son, his expression radiating absolute, unadulterated contempt. "You always were a spectacular disappointment." "Richard," Teddy stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble that cut through the storm. "But I never imagined you would be stupid enough to try and steal my empire while I was still sitting in the throne room." You knew?" Brenda stammered, her voice shaking violently. "I knew every single time you transferred money out of my retirement accounts," Teddy replied coldly. "I knew when you forged the medical evaluations. I knew when you used my life savings to buy designer garbage and fund Cameron's pathetic bankrupt shell company. I sat in that chair and watched you actively plan to bleed me dry while you paraded around Europe." "But Dad, we can explain." Richard pleaded, his arrogance entirely, replaced by naked, shivering desperation. "The business was struggling. We needed a bridge loan. I was going to pay it back. I swear you were going to let me rot in a nursing home the second the accounts were empty." Teddy shot back, his voice rising in anger. "You are a thief, Richard. A pathetic, incompetent thief who could not even successfully embezzle money without leaving a paper trail a mile wide. Teddy turned to me, his expression softening only slightly. Gwendolyn has the complete unredacted audit. She has the deed to this property. She holds the controlling shares of Cameron's fraudulent company. She is the sole legal administrator of my estate, and as of this morning she has frozen every single financial asset you possess. The reality of their situation finally crushed them completely. They were not just locked out of the house, they were locked out of their entire privileged existence. The money was gone, the company was gone, the house was gone. Brenda dropped to her knees in the slush, the freezing water soaking instantly through her thin designer pants. She gripped the cold iron bars of the gate, her knuckles white, her face twisted in an expression of absolute manipulative desperation. "Gwen, please," Brenda wailed, her voice a shrill, piercing shriek. "You cannot do this to us. We are your parents. Cameron is your brother. We are your family. You have to let us in. We are freezing. Please, Gwen. We are your family." I stared down at the woman kneeling in the slush. Brenda's expensive mascara was running in dark, jagged streaks down her cheeks, her pristine salon blowout plastered to her face by the biting wind and wet snow. She looked absolutely pathetic, stripping away decades of carefully manufactured country club superiority to beg like a common trespasser. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy. I did not feel the familiar suffocating guilt that had dictated my entire childhood. I took another slow, warming sip of my Earl Grey tea, letting the steam wash over my face, and handed the ceramic mug to Teddy. He took it with a silent, approving nod. I pulled my cashmere wrap tighter around my shoulders and began my descent down the wide stone steps. My heavy winter boots crunched methodically against the fresh snow as I walked the length of the long driveway toward the main security gate. Richard, Brenda Cameron, and Jada watched my approach with wide, desperate eyes, clinging to the wrought iron bars like prisoners begging a warden for clemency. From the deep pocket of my coat, I retrieved a thick, heavily sealed legal folder. Attorney Donovan had prepared it with his signature ruthless efficiency before departing the estate. "You love using that word," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the howling winter wind. I stopped just a few feet away from the heavy iron gate, looking directly into my mother's terrified eyes. "Family. You use it as a weapon, Brenda. You use it as a shield when you get caught. But family does not steal an old man's retirement to buy Chanel. Family does not leave their daughter a mocking note assigning her diaper duty while they fly first class to Paris." I stepped forward and shoved the thick legal folder directly through the narrow gap between the frozen iron bars. It hit Richard squarely in the chest. He fumbled with his numb, freezing hands, barely managing to catch it before it dropped into the gray slush. "Open it," I commanded. Richard frantically tore at the seal, pulling out the heavy watermarked documents. The harsh glare of the streetlights above illuminated the bold, uncompromising black text. Cameron leaned over his father's shoulder, his teeth chattering audibly as his eyes darted across the complex legal jargon. The top document is a formal court-ordered eviction notice. I stated, delivering the information with the exact same clinical detachment I used in hostile corporate boardrooms. "It officially revokes your residency at this address." The second document is a certified copy of the property transfer deeds. "I am the sole legal owner of this estate, and I am formally trespassing you from the premises." Richard stared at the papers, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. "Gwen, you cannot legally do this without a 30-day notice. We have tenant rights. You lost your tenant rights the moment you committed federal financial fraud to pay for your luxury vacation," I countered effortlessly. Donovan explicitly drafted an emergency forfeiture clause based on extreme elder abuse and grand larceny. "If you want to argue tenant law, you can do it from a jail cell." I shifted my cold gaze to my brother, who was staring blankly at the third stack of papers in Richard's trembling hands. "And Cameron," I continued, ensuring my voice carried the full devastating weight of his absolute failure. "The final document is the immediate corporate liquidation of Novatech Solutions. I executed my majority shareholder rights an hour ago. The corporate shell is officially dissolved. Your fraudulent executive title is terminated. The stolen money has been aggressively clawed back into the primary trust. You are legally, entirely, and permanently bankrupt. Cameron let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, stumbling backward away from the gate as if the iron bars had suddenly become electrified. I looked at the four of them, shivering violently in the brutal Chicago winter, completely stripped of their wealth, their home, and their arrogant pride. "You have 10 minutes to collect the boxes sitting in the driveway," I announced, pointing toward a small stack of basic cardboard boxes resting just inside the pedestrian gate. They contained a few cheap winter coats and basic toiletries I had mercifully spared from the junk removal service. "The rest of your trash is currently sitting in a cheap, unheated storage unit downtown. I included the address and the padlock key in the folder. Do not ever return to this property." Before Richard could launch into another desperate screaming plea, a sudden violent movement shattered the group's dynamic. Jada lunged forward and snatched the corporate liquidation papers right out of Richard's hands. She aggressively scanned the documents, her eyes frantically absorbing the brutal, undeniable reality of Cameron's total insolvency. The digital files I had sent her earlier were merely a warning. These watermarked, legally binding papers were the absolute execution. Her husband was not a misunderstood billionaire suffering a temporary cash flow problem. He was a broke, fraudulent liability who had just been publicly stripped of his fake empire. Jada let out a sound that was half scream, half hysterical laugh. She turned toward Cameron, her flawless face contorted with absolute, unadulterated rage. "You broke, pathetic, lying piece of garbage," Jada roared, completely ignoring the freezing snow blowing around them. "You do not have a company. You do not have a house. You do not even have a car. I married a tech CEO, not a homeless fraud who steals from his own grandfather." "Jada, baby. Please," Cameron stammered, raising his hands in a desperate, pleading gesture. "I can fix this. I have investors. I can pitch a new startup. We just need to ride this out." Jada did not let him finish. With a swift, aggressive motion, she reached for her left hand. She violently yanked the massive custom-designed diamond engagement ring and the matching wedding band off her freezing finger. Cameron had likely purchased them using stolen trust funds, and Jada clearly no longer cared about their resale value. She threw the heavy rings directly at Cameron's chest. The diamonds hit his ruined designer coat with a sharp thud and bounced off, disappearing instantly into the dirty, freezing slush at his feet. "I am filing for divorce the second the courts open," Jada snarled, stepping backward and pulling her smartphone from her coat pocket. "Do not ever call me again." Cameron dropped to his knees in the wet snow, frantically digging through the freezing gray slush, with his bare hands desperately trying to find the discarded jewelry. Brenda shrieked, dropping down beside her golden child, trying to pull him back to his feet while screaming at Jada for her ultimate betrayal. Jada ignored them completely. She tapped furiously on her phone screen, her face illuminated by the harsh digital glow. I watched from the other side of the iron gate as the headlights of a black SUV rounded the corner of the suburban street. Jada had already ordered an Uber the moment she stepped out of the taxi. She had known the execution was coming, and she was ensuring her own immediate escape. The SUV pulled up to the curb, tires splashing through the winter slush. Jada opened the rear door, climbed into the warm, heated cabin, and slammed the door shut without a single backward glance. The vehicle immediately sped off down the dark street, leaving Cameron on his knees in the freezing snow, weeping over a lost ring and a shattered, fraudulent marriage. The black SUV vanished into the swirling winter night, its red taillights swallowed completely by the relentless Chicago blizzard. The silence that fell over the driveway was heavy, broken only by the howling wind, and the pathetic, wretched sounds of my brother sobbing in the freezing slush. Cameron remained on his hands and knees, his bare, freezing fingers blindly scraping through the toxic mixture of road salt and gray ice, desperately searching for a diamond ring that would not save him even if he found it. His fragile, manufactured ego had been completely obliterated. He was no longer the brilliant tech visionary. He was a ruined, abandoned fraud weeping in the snow. Brenda stood frozen for a moment, her eyes darting from the empty street, where her daughter-in-law had just fled down to her golden child, groveling in the dirt. The reality of their absolute isolation was finally crushing the last remnants of her aristocratic delusions. The money was gone. The fake prestige was gone. Her carefully curated country club empire was burned to ash. They had absolutely nothing and no one left in the world but each other. She slowly turned her gaze back toward the heavy wrought iron gates. The fierce, aggressive entitlement that had defined her entire existence vanished instantly, replaced by a raw, suffocating panic. She took a step toward the iron bars, her expensive, ruined designer shoes slipping on the icy pavement. She did not yell. She did not issue a sharp maternal command. Brenda dropped heavily to her knees in the freezing slush. The icy, dirty water soaked instantly through her thin luxury trousers, but she did not seem to register the biting cold. She reached out, wrapping her trembling, manicured hands around the frozen black iron of the security gate. She looked up at me, her mascara completely ruined her face, pale and twisted in an expression of absolute, unadulterated desperation. "Gwen, please." Brenda sobbed, her voice a fragile, broken rasp against the brutal winter wind. "You cannot leave us out here. We have nowhere to go. We have no money for a hotel. We do not have a car. You cannot just lock your own parents out in the snow. Please, sweetheart, I am begging you." I stood perfectly still on my side of the gate, wrapped securely in my warm cashmere. I looked down at the woman who had spent 34 years making me feel like a worthless, bitter inconvenience. I watched her beg for the exact same mercy she had callously denied me when she left that cruel, dismissive note on the kitchen island just 1 week ago. "We are your family, Gwen." Brenda pleaded, her tears freezing on her cheeks as she pressed her face against the unforgiving iron bars. "You have to forgive us. Families make mistakes, but they stick together. We share blood. You have to show some family loyalty. We will do whatever you want. Just open the gate and let us come inside. Please, I am your mother." I looked down at her with eyes like absolute ice. I did not feel a single flicker of guilt. I did not feel the familiar suffocating weight of daughterly obligation. The trauma bond that had chained me to her toxic expectations had been permanently severed the moment I signed those transfer deeds. "Family does not steal from their elders to fund their vanity," I stated, my voice ringing out with a cold, lethal clarity that cut straight through her pathetic sobbing. "You used my grandfather as a bank account to buy your designer clothes, and you used me as a convenient maid so you could parade around Paris. You chose your luxury. Now enjoy the consequences." Brenda let out a loud, devastated wail, sagging against the heavy gate. Richard, who had been standing a few feet away in a state of absolute catatonic shock, finally moved. He stumbled forward, reaching down to grab Brenda by the shoulders, desperately trying to pull her up from the freezing slush. His face was a mask of sheer terror, but he was not looking at me anymore. He had completely stopped fighting for the house. His head jerked toward the distance, his eyes wide and panicked. He heard it before I did. Rising above the howling winter wind, cutting sharply through the dead of the night, came the unmistakable piercing wail of approaching sirens. It was not just one. It was a chorus of them, a heavy, coordinated response rapidly converging on our exclusive suburban street. Richard's breath hitched violently. He knew exactly what that sound meant. Attorney Donovan had not just filed the financial injunctions, he had submitted the complete, unredacted forensic audit directly to the federal authorities. The police were not arriving to conduct a simple wellness check. They were coming to execute a federal arrest warrant for grand larceny and severe financial fraud. "They are coming for me," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with a profound, suffocating dread. "Brenda, we have to go. We have to run. Run where, Richard? You do not have a single dollar to your name," I reminded him, my voice completely devoid of any pity. The flashing red and blue lights broke through the heavy snowfall at the end of the long street, reflecting violently off the pristine white lawns of the neighboring estates. Multiple squad cars were speeding directly toward the front gates of the property, their sirens blaring a deafening, inescapable song of absolute reckoning. I did not stay to watch them place my father in handcuffs. I did not stay to watch my mother scream as the police read them their rights in the freezing snow. Their public humiliation was no longer my concern. My audit was officially closed. I turned my back on the screaming, desperate mess of my former family and walked calmly up the wide stone steps of my estate. I stepped through the grand double doors and into the welcoming, luxurious warmth of the grand foyer. I pulled out my phone and tapped the security interface one final time. The heavy smart locks engaged behind me with a loud, satisfying, and permanent electronic click. I walked down the long, quiet hallway and pushed open the oak doors of the den. The room was bathed in the warm, dancing, and golden light of a roaring fire I had lit earlier. The freezing storm raging outside was completely sealed away, leaving nothing but absolute, untouchable tranquility. Grandpa Teddy was sitting in his favorite leather wingback chair right next to the crackling hearth. He looked deeply relaxed, the heavy burden of his family's betrayal completely lifted from his shoulders. He held two heavy crystal tumblers, pouring a generous measure of his finest top-shelf bourbon into each. He looked up as I entered, a genuine, deeply proud smile breaking across his weathered face. He extended one of the glasses toward me. I walked over, taking the crystal tumbler. The rich amber liquid caught the firelight, glowing with the warmth of a secured legacy. "To the new administration," Teddy said, raising his glass in a firm, respectful salute. I smiled, a deep and unshakable peace settling into my soul. I raised my glass to meet his. The heavy crystal clinked together with a sharp, clear ring that echoed beautifully in the quiet, firelit room. "To a flawless victory," I replied. We took a slow, warming sip of the bourbon, completely untouched by the chaos outside, finally enjoying the absolute quiet perfection of our newly reclaimed empire. The story of Gwen and Teddy offers a chilling but empowering lesson. Your worth is never defined by those who are committed to misunderstanding you. For years, Gwen's family treated her as a disposable asset, prioritizing a manufactured image over genuine connection. However, her journey proves that setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but one of profound self-respect. We learn that true family isn't just about sharing DNA. It is about mutual respect, loyalty, and integrity. Take back your power today by setting firm boundaries, and share your own stories of reclaiming your peace in the comments below.